Greetings, lore masters. Tonight, our chronicle covers the absolute fundamentals of murder, a deep dive into the 15 levels of assassination. Imagine, if you will, the biting winds of Skyrim tearing across the frozen tundra outside of Whiterun. You are crouched in the freezing mud, an iron dagger clutched in a white-knuckled grip, waiting for the perfect moment to slip the blade between a bandit's ribs. Let's be honest though, you probably wouldn't survive a trip to Cold Harbour, let alone a chilly night in the Reach, without some serious enchanted gear and a massive thermos of hot cocoa. So, before you relax, please subscribe. Tell me down in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what your local time is. I always love seeing how far across Mundus our little fireside chats reach. Now, settle in and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The art of assassination does not begin with an ancient guild or a whispered prayer to the void. It begins with the simple, agonizingly slow act of putting one foot in front of the other. Long before the Night Mother speaks, or a contract is sealed in blood, there is the fundamental lesson of the shadows. The basic mechanics of stealth are the bedrock upon which empires of fear are built. A novice must first learn to silence their own heartbeat before they can ever hope to stop someone else's. The shadows are not just an absence of light. To the seasoned prowler, they are a physical medium. They have texture. They drape over the damp stonework of ancient Nordic ruins like heavy velvet. Stepping into the dark requires a shift in consciousness. The prowler lowers their centre of gravity, rolling their weight carefully from the heel to the ball of the foot. The breathing slows, matching the rhythmic drip of condensation falling from stalactites in some forgotten cave. A rusty iron dagger in hand feels heavy, its edge dulled by neglect, yet in the dark it holds the terrifying potential to sever a life thread. Of course, the journey of 1,000 successful assassinations usually begins with a few embarrassing mistakes. Everyone starts somewhere, right? Usually that somewhere involves accidentally kicking an empty wooden bucket down a flight of stone stairs and alerting every bandit within a 3-mile radius. Yet, there is a strange, almost comforting leniency in the minds of Tamriel's criminal underworld. You could sink an iron arrow directly into the eye socket of a bandit marauder, watch him stumble backward, and if you simply crouch very, very still in the shadows for about 30 seconds, his surviving friends will inevitably conclude that it must have been the wind. It is a remarkable level of cognitive dissonance, really. But for an aspiring assassin, it is an absolute lifesaver. The fundamental truth of stealth in Tamriel is rooted in observation and the mechanics of detection. For those walking the path of shadows, there is a constant, almost physical sense of being watched. Every prowler learns to trust that instinctual feeling, the opening and closing of that mental eye. When a target is entirely oblivious, the eye is completely shut, representing a comforting line of absolute concealment. The moment a sound is made, the scrape of leather on stone, the rustle of a cloak, the eye cracks open. The tension spikes. This detection mechanic is the universal law of survival for a thief or assassin. It dictates when to strike and when to freeze. It is a phenomenon so deeply ingrained in the rogue's experience that it has sparked endless metaphysical discussions. Fans still debate whether the detection eye reticle is merely a necessary gameplay convenience, or if it represents something far more canonical, perhaps the literal gaze of Nocturnal herself, or an unconscious psychic connection to the ambient magicka of the world. Some lore scholars argue that every thief, whether they worship the Daedric princes or not, taps into a low-level divination magic that simply manifests as that opening and closing eye in their mind. Whatever the true nature of this sixth sense, it is the lifeline that keeps the amateur alive long enough to become a professional, and becoming a professional takes an absurd amount of patience. There is a certain grim hilarity in watching a heavily armed warrior attempting to grasp the nuances of stealth for the first time. Imagine trying to creep silently through a hushed library while wearing full Daedric armour, the sheer audacity of tiptoeing in boots that weigh as much as a small horse, covered in jagged obsidian spikes that catch on every conceivable piece of furniture, is a spectacle unto itself. It takes a profound lack of self-awareness to think you are blending in with the shadows while glowing red like a Daedric holiday ornament. The true foundation of stealth, however, is not just about shedding heavy armour or sticking to the unlit corners of a dungeon. It is an intricate science of anatomy and environmental awareness. There is an obscure lore text, highly prized among the criminal syndicates of the Imperial City and beyond, known as advances in lockpicking. While its title suggests a narrow focus on tumblers and springs, the margins of the original manuscript are famously filled with handwritten notes on the broader philosophy of the unseen approach. The author, a legendary thief, notes that a shadow is only as deep as the ignorance of the man standing in the light. This principle extends beyond thievery and into the realm of lethal strikes. The text implies that true invisibility is not about magic, it is about making yourself so entirely unremarkable that the mind of the observer simply filters you out. You become part of the architecture, a trick of the candlelight, a mere draught of cold air. Let us return to that freezing mud outside Whiterun. The target is a lone sentry, pacing outside a dilapidated fort, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The novice assassin watches from a patch of tall, frost-rimmed grass. Here, in the absolute basics of the blade, there are no elaborate poisons brewed from Nirnroot and Deathbell. There are no muffle enchantments woven into dark leather by master enchanters. There is only raw physics and the terrifying frailty of the mortal body. The assassin must calculate the sentry's patrol route, counting the seconds between turns. 1, 2, 3. A pause to check the horizon. 4, 5. A shuffle of the feet. This is the rhythm of the mundane, the metronome of a life about to be extinguished. The cold seeps through the assassin's thin linen clothing, biting at the skin, threatening to force a shiver that could ruin everything. But the discipline of the shadow demands absolute stillness. When the moment finally arrives, the movement must be explosive yet entirely devoid of sound. The novice rises from the frost, boots finding the softest patches of earth. The approach is made entirely in the target's blind spot. It is a terrifying intimacy, stepping so close to a stranger that you can smell the stale mead on their breath, the sweat trapped beneath their thick furs. And if you want to get genuinely good at this, of course, the most logical method in Tamriel is to find an unobservant tavern patron, crouch in a dark corner, and just walk backward into a wooden pillar for about 3 straight days. The local guards might look at you like you have lost your mind, but your leg muscles will become spectacularly adept at silent movement. It is a grueling, splinter-filled path to greatness, but it undeniably gets results. But back to our sentry. The final step is the hardest. The strike itself must be precise. An iron dagger is not a forgiving weapon. It lacks the razor-sharp edge of refined glass or the terrifying, jagged profile of dragon bone. To execute a lethal blow with basic steel, the novice must understand the spaces between armor plates, the exact location of the carotid artery, or the soft vulnerability at the base of the skull. The hand shoots forward. A muffled gasp, a sudden slump of heavy weight. The assassin lowers the body gently to the ground, guiding it down to prevent the loud clatter of steel against stone. The eye in the mind's eye, that ever-watchful gaze of the shadows, remains closed. The absolute silence of the snowy night rushes back in to fill the space where a life used to be. This is the first level of assassination. It is crude, it is terrifying, and it is intimately violent. It requires a profound dissociation from the act of killing, transforming a fellow mortal into a puzzle of patrol routes, sightlines, and anatomical vulnerabilities. There is no glory in this initial plunge into the dark. There is only the cold sweat drying on the brow, the metallic scent of fresh blood, and the terrifying realization that it is actually quite easy to erase a person from the world, provided you are quiet enough. The psychological toll of this first true assassination cannot be understated. Unlike the chaos of a battlefield, where adrenaline and screaming mask the gravity of the act, the silent kill is performed in a vacuum of introspection. The assassin hears the final hitched breath. They feel the sudden, catastrophic loss of tension in the victim's musculature. In that suspended second, the killer and the killed are locked in a grotesque embrace, bound by a secret that only one of them will walk away from. For many who try their hand at the shadow's path, this intimacy is too much. They drop their blades, flee into the night, and return to the honest, chaotic clamour of a broadsword. But for a select few, that cold silence is intoxicating. The absence of consequence, the sheer, unadulterated power of holding a life in the palm of a hand, and snuffing it out without the world ever noticing. This is the seductive whisper of the shadows. It is an addiction that starts with a rusted iron dagger and a sleeping bandit, but it inevitably demands sharper tools, higher stakes, and more intricate challenges. The world of Tamriel is vast, populated by kings, emperors, and heavily guarded nobles. An iron dagger and a quiet footstep are merely the alphabet. The true language of assassination has yet to be spoken. The novice stands at the edge of a precipice, staring down into an abyss that stretches out beneath the foundations of society itself. And so, our aspiring killer takes a deep breath of the freezing night air. The scent of pine and iron fills their lungs. They look at their trembling hands, realizing that the blood washes off, but the knowledge of how easily it was spilled remains forever. The foundation is set. The basic tenets of stealth, patience, timing, and a complete disregard for heavy armor have been internalized. The path ahead is paved with darker deeds and deeper mysteries. For now, the novice wipes the iron blade clean on the dead man's cloak, sheathes it with a soft click, and melts back into the frost-rimmed grass. The journey has begun. That iron dagger, slick with the lifeblood of a careless bandit in the freezing Skyrim mud, is only the preamble to a much darker manuscript. When our novice assassin watched the light fade from their target's eyes, they weren't just witnessing biological failure. They were peering over the edge of a cosmic precipice. The absolute silence that rushes in to fill the space where a life used to be isn't just an absence of noise. It is a tangible, heavy presence. It is the void. And once a killer learns to feel its cold, comforting embrace, they stop being a mere murderer and become an instrument of something far older than the gods themselves. To understand the highest echelons of assassination in Tamriel, one must first understand the chilling philosophy that underpins it. We must talk about Sithis. If you wander into any Dark Brotherhood sanctuary, perhaps hidden beneath an abandoned house in Cheydinhall or tucked away in a snowy Falkreath cave, you will find the same morbid interior design. There is always an altar, a stained glass window depicting dark motifs, and an eerie, glowing shrine featuring an unnerving skeletal figure. If you are going to dedicate your life to a cosmic manifestation of absolute nothingness, you might as well get some heavily branded black and red leather armor and a cool subterranean clubhouse out of the deal. But who, or rather what, is Sithis? To call Sithis a god is to fundamentally misunderstand the architecture of the Aurbis. The deities you find worshipped in the sunlit temples of the Empire, the Aedra who built the world, or the Daedric princes who constantly try to mess it up, are all beings of profound, overwhelming somethingness. They have personalities, spheres of influence, and a desperate need for mortal validation. Sithis is the antithesis of all that. Sithis is the original emptiness, the chilling void of space between the stars. It is the primal force of chaos and entropy that existed before the universe even bothered to form a coherent thought. In the sleepy, ambient dark of an assassin's quarters, the philosophy of the void offers a bizarre kind of comfort. There is an obscure, esoteric in-game text simply titled Sithis, which is notoriously difficult to parse but essential for any high-ranking executioner. The book details a fascinating alternative creation myth. It states that before creation, there was only a boring, stagnant state of absolute stasis, often personified as Anu. Sithis, representing Padme or Chaos, was the force that sundered this nothingness. He mutated the stagnant parts, fashioning them into myriad possibilities. According to this text, it was the inspiration of Sithis that drove Lorcan to trick the other spirits into creating Mundus, the mortal realm. Therefore, in the twisted logic of a Shadow Walker, creation itself was an act of chaos, a temporary disruption of the sacred emptiness. Life is an anomaly. Death, then, is not a tragedy. It is a correction. When an assassin slides a poisoned blade into the ribs of a corrupt noble, they are not committing a crime against nature. They are returning borrowed energy back to the original cosmic bank account. It's a bit like cosmic tax evasion, but instead of the Imperial Legion knocking on your door with a warrant, it's an associate in a skin-tight black suit offering you a poisoned apple. Embracing this dark philosophy changes the physical act of the kill. It elevates it from a desperate struggle in the mud to a somber religious sacrament. The seasoned assassin does not strike out of anger, malice, or even greed. Though the exorbitant sacks of gold certainly help soften the blow, They strike to feed the void, they become a conduit. Imagine the sensation. The assassin stands perfectly still in the shadows of a grand bedchamber, watching the target sleep. The air grows thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and old dried blood. The assassin's heartbeat slows to a near stop, syncing with the sluggish, creeping hum of entropy that underscores the universe. When the strike happens, it is flawlessly efficient. The blade severs the flesh, and the dark red pool that spreads across the satin sheets is seen as a beautiful, fleeting offering. As the target's soul is violently evicted from its mortal shell, the assassin feels a subtle, chilling rush of wind, the breath of Sithis, welcoming another child home. Honestly, an eternity of dark, silent emptiness doesn't sound entirely terrible after a 3-day bender fighting cliff races in the ash wastes of Vardenfell, but the sheer fanaticism it inspires is terrifying to behold. This fanaticism brings us to one of the most fiercely contested subjects within the lore community. Fans constantly debate the true nature of Sithis and his relationship with the assassins who kill in his name. The debate hinges on a simple question. Is Sithis actually a sentient being with a will, or is he just a blind, uncaring force of nature? One camp argues that Sithis is entirely aware. They point to the fact that the Dark Brotherhood receives specific contracts, supposedly handed down from Sithis to his spectral bride, the Night Mother, who then whispers them to her listener. They cite the wrath of Sithis, a terrifying spectral entity summoned to punish those who break the Brotherhood's sacred tenets. How could an unfeeling void harbour wrath or care about organisational rules? The opposing camp, however, leans into the cold, hard logic of the law. They argue that a true void cannot possess a personality. They propose that Sithis is merely the gravitational pull of entropy, and that the Dark Brotherhood has entirely anthropomorphized him to justify their murder cult. In this view, the Night Mother is not a conduit for a dark god, but a tremendously powerful, manipulative undead spirit who uses the abstract concept of Sithis as a boogeyman to maintain absolute control over her followers. The void is real, but the Dread Father who supposedly rules it is just a convenient, terrifying fiction designed to keep a guild of sociopaths in line. Whether sentient god or unfeeling abyss, the psychological effect on the assassin remains exactly the same. The philosophy of the void strips away the crippling weight of mortal morality. If all life is just a chaotic illusion destined to be swallowed by nothingness, then guilt is a useless emotion. Pity is a flaw in the execution. Empathy is a chain that binds you to the fragile, temporary world of the living. To master the highest levels of assassination, one must cut those chains completely. This is why the transition from our novice in the freezing grass to a true acolyte of the dark is so profound. The novice killed because they had to, or because they were paid, and they felt the terrifying intimacy of taking a life. The master kills because the void demands it, and they feel nothing at all. They allow the chilling emptiness to seep into their very bones, replacing their mortal warmth with the absolute zero of the abyss. They walk through the crowded, bustling markets of solitude or the sun-drenched streets of the imperial city, and they do not see people. They see ghosts who just haven't realised they are dead yet. It is a lonely, cold existence. The shadows cease to be a hiding place and become a permanent residence. The assassin begins to find the vibrant noise of the world grating, an offensive clatter against the perfect, soothing silence of the dark. They long for the quiet moments after the blade has done its work, standing over the cooling corpse, eyes closed, listening to the faint cosmic hum of entropy at the edge of the universe. This total submission to death is what makes an assassin truly terrifying. They cannot be reasoned with, because they do not share your values. They cannot be intimidated, because they have already made their peace with the end of all things. They are the physical embodiment of a mathematical certainty. Everything that lives must eventually die. They just happen to be the ones expediting the paperwork. Yet, this deeply religious, fanatical approach to murder is not the only way the shadows have been utilised in Tamriel. Long before the Dark Brotherhood began whispering their prayers to the void, another organisation had perfected the art of the kill. But they didn't do it for a dark god, and they didn't do it in secret. They did it in the broad daylight of legality, bound by ancient codes and political pragmatism. Before we can fully understand the bloody, cult-like frenzy of the Night Mother's children, we must travel east into the ash-choked skies of Morrowind to examine the cold, calculated origins of institutionalised slaughter. The shadows are deep, my friends, and the void is always waiting. But sometimes, the most effective murders are the ones sanctioned by the state. We leave the freezing tundras and icy crypts of Skyrim behind us now, trading the crisp scent of pine for a much harsher, drier atmosphere. Imagine the sky turning a bruised, unnatural purple. The air grows thick, tasting faintly of sulfur, pulverized rock, and burnt paper. You are walking the cantons of Vivec City in the province of Morrowind. During the waning days of the Third Era, volcanic ash from the looming peak of Red Mountain falls gently around you, dusting your shoulders like grey snow. It is a harsh, alien landscape, filled with giant insects, paranoid wizards, and ancient, bitter rivalries. In this land, the shadows do not merely hide the desperate or the fanatical, they hide the practical. For thousands of years, Morrowind was ruled by the great houses, vast, sprawling political dynasties like House Redoran, House Hlalu, and House Telvanni. And where there is politics, there is inevitable, spectacular backstabbing. But the Dunmer, the Dark Elves of this land, are a remarkably pragmatic people. They recognized early on that allowing noble houses to wage open, bloody warfare over every trade dispute or perceived insult would quickly reduce their already hostile island to a lifeless cinder. Enter the Morag Tong. If the Dark Brotherhood is a subterranean cult of murder-obsessed zealots, the Morag Tong is the ultimate, hyper-efficient bureaucratic solution to violence. They are Tamriel's premier, legally sanctioned guild of assassins. Yes, you heard that correctly. In Morrowind, murder isn't just a crime, it is an institution. It is an organized, regulated, and heavily taxed public utility. It's an incredible piece of legal gymnastics. The great houses essentially agreed. We cannot stop you from brutally eliminating your rivals, but we can absolutely make you fill out the proper forms in triplicate before you do it. This brings us to a core, undeniable fact of in-game lore that any outlander stepping off the boat in Vardenfell quickly learns to fear and respect. Honourable Writ of Execution. To employ the Morag Tong, a noble must petition the guild's Grand Master, present their grievances, and pay a frankly exorbitant fee. If the hit is deemed justified by the guild's strict internal codes, a writ is issued. This piece of parchment is an assassin's absolute, indisputable legal shield. The execution of a writ fundamentally changes the physical and psychological dynamics of the kill. An assassin of the Morag Tong does not necessarily need to wait for the target to fall asleep in a locked tower. They do not need to whisper prayers to the void. They simply need to locate the target, execute them with ruthless efficiency, and then, in a display of unparalleled audacity, present the writ to the local authorities. Imagine the sheer surrealism of this scenario. You track a corrupt Hlalu merchant to a bustling, sunlit plaza in Balmora. The market is packed with merchants hawking scrib jelly and kwama eggs. You walk right up to your target, draw a perfectly honed glass dagger, and slide it neatly under their ribs. The merchant collapses. The crowd screams. A heavily armoured ordinator, Morrowind's terrifying, masked religious police, comes sprinting toward you, mace drawn, ready to cave your skull in for disrupting the peace. And what do? You don't cast an invisibility spell. You don't drop a smoke bomb. You calmly reach into your tunic, pull out a piece of blood-spattered parchment, and hand it to the guard. The ordinator stops. He reads the paper, nods sagely, hands it back, and effectively says, "Ah, an honourable writ. Everything seems to be in order here. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, citizen." It is the equivalent of stabbing a CEO in the middle of a corporate board meeting, handing the security guard a signed permission slip, and just strolling out to grab a sweet roll. It is a level of institutionalized apathy that borders on high art. But to view the Morag Tong merely as state-sponsored hitmen is to miss the deep, religious undercurrent that governs their existence. Their origins are ancient, predating the modern empire and even the Dark Brotherhood. To understand their roots, we must look to an obscure, highly prized lore text known as Fire and Darkness, the Brotherhoods of Death. This text, often hidden away in the restricted sections of the Arcane University or buried in the dusty manors of Telvanni lords, details the true nature of the Tong's foundation. According to Fire and Darkness, The Morag Tong was not born from a desire for gold or a love of the void. It was founded by and dedicated to the Daedric prince Mephala, the web spinner. Mephala is the prince of lies, sex, murder, and secrets. But unlike the chaotic, entropic nothingness of Sithis, Mephala's sphere is incredibly intricate. She weaves the grand, invisible web of mortal affairs, pulling strings to cause subtle shifts in power. The text reveals that the Chimera, the ancestors of the modern Dark Elves, were taught the arts of evasion and assassination directly by Mephala to help them survive in a hostile world. The Morag Tong, therefore, views their sanctioned murders not as chaotic acts of destruction, but as careful, deliberate snips of the shears upon Mephala's vast web. By legally assassinating a key political figure, they release the tension in the web, preventing the massive, catastrophic tearing that a full-scale war would cause. They are, in their own twisted, bloody way, peacekeepers. They maintain the delicate balance of power in Morrowind through the precise application of a poisoned blade. They kill the few to save the many, all while chanting silent praises to the web spinner. This philosophical divide between the Morag Tong's pragmatic, Mephala-driven executions and the Dark Brotherhood's chaotic, Sithis-worshipping murder frenzy is the source of one of the most enduring and fiercely debated fan theories in the entire Elder Scrolls community. The debate centers on a single, maddening question. Are Mephala and the Night Mother actually the exact same entity? The evidence is compelling. The Dark Brotherhood officially splintered off from the Morag Tong during the Second Era. The Tong had become too public, too embroiled in a disastrous political overreach that saw them temporarily outlawed across Tamriel. A faction within the guild, disgusted by the bureaucracy and hungering for a more primal, unfettered approach to killing, broke away. They found guidance in the voice of the Night Mother, who directed them to worship Sithis and kill not for politics, but for the sheer, chaotic joy of the void. But many lore scholars, both in-game and within the fan community, argue that the void does not speak. They argue that Sithis is just a dark, empty concept, and that the Night Mother is simply a new disguise adopted by Mephala. Why would she do this? Because Mephala is the Daedric prince of secrets and plots. What could possibly be more appealing to the web spinner than secretly controlling two violently opposed assassin guilds, pitting them against each other in a shadow war across the continent? Knowing the twisted psychology of the Daedric princes, treating two rival organizations of highly trained killers like a cosmic, blood-soaked ant farm is completely on brand. The theory suggests that Mephala grew bored with the legal, predictable nature of the Morag Tong's writs. She wanted a wild card, a chaotic element, introduced into the world to stir the pot. So, she whispered to a disgruntled faction, gave them a new name, a new terrifying god to worship, and set them loose upon Tamriel. It is a chilling thought that the most feared assassins in the world are not serving a primordial force of entropy, but are merely pawns in a Daedric prince's elaborate, centuries-long prank. Regardless of whether the Night Mother is Mephala in disguise or a completely separate, terrifying entity, the operational differences between the two guilds remain stark. The Morag Tong assassin is a professional, a recognized tradesman in the complex society of Morrowind. They hone their skills in broad daylight, study the political landscape, and execute their targets with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb. They rely on their legal immunity to bypass the arduous infiltration and extraction protocols that other assassins must obsess over. But as the ashes of Red Mountain continue to fall, burying the past in a thick layer of grey dust, the era of the Morag Tong's absolute supremacy slowly wanes. The legality of murder is a fragile concept, bound strictly to the borders of Morrowind. Step 1 foot outside the province, into the forests of Cyrodiil or the deserts of Hammerfell, and an honourable writ of execution is just a worthless piece of paper. The world outside the Ashlands does not respect the rules of the great houses. The world outside demands a different kind of killer. It demands shadows that are absolute. It demands killers who do not ask for permission, who do not carry permits, and who do not care about the balance of political power. As the strict, bureaucratic grip of the Morag Tong began to slip, that disgruntled, radical offshoot, the faction that craved the pure, unadulterated thrill of the kill without the red tape, began to spread its roots. They retreated into deep subterranean sanctuaries, traded the intricate web of Mephala for the terrifying, endless abyss of Sithis, and prepared to introduce Tamriel to a whole new level of fear. The legal murders of the East were merely the prologue. The true nightmare, bound in black leather and whispering to a corpse, was just beginning to stir. The transition from the legally sanctioned bureaucratic assassinations of the Morag Tong to the fanatical subterranean nightmare of the Dark Brotherhood is somewhat akin to a hostile corporate takeover. That is, if the boardroom was completely drenched in blood and the standard severance package was a poisoned dagger to the throat. When that disgruntled faction of killers fled the ash-choked skies of Morrowind, they were not just seeking a change of scenery, they were fundamentally rejecting the idea that death should be controlled by politicians, governed by rules, or restricted by borders. They wanted to rip the leash off the beast. As they spread their roots beneath the soil of Cyrodiil, Skyrim, and beyond, they traded the intricate, web-like plots of Mephala for the terrifying, endless abyss of Sithis. The Morag Tong had forms in triplicate, complex legal precedents, and honorable writs. The Dark Brotherhood simply has you wake up in an abandoned shack to a masked figure watching you sleep, who then hands you a black Sacrament contract and politely asks you to commit a felony. Honestly, it's a much more streamlined onboarding process. No paperwork, just pure, unadulterated devotion to the void. To manage this newly unfettered chaos, the Brotherhood needed an entirely different kind of leadership structure. They did away with the Grand Masters and public guild halls, replacing them with a shadowy hierarchy known as the Black Hand. This is a core piece of established law that anyone who has ever found a mysterious Black Hand-printed letter in their inventory learns very quickly. The Black Hand is the ruling council of the Brotherhood, and its structure perfectly mirrors its namesake. It consists of one listener, who acts as the thumb, pointing the way by receiving contracts directly from the Night Mother. Then, there are 4 speakers, acting as the fingers, who relay these contracts. Finally, each speaker employs a personal assassin known as a silencer, the sharp, lethal fingernail poised at the end of each digit, ready to strike without question. It is a brilliantly neat, macabre organizational chart. When a silencer is deployed, they do not carry an honorable writ. They carry only the absolute authority of the hand. This structure allows the Brotherhood to operate as a completely decentralized, cellular cult. If a sanctuary is compromised, the rot can be severed before it infects the hand itself. The speakers remain safely hidden in the shadows, sipping fine Colovian wine in their manners, while their silencers do the messy work of bleeding out merchants in the sewers. But a neat organizational structure does not automatically grant you the title of Tamriel's most feared organization. To earn that, you have to do something so unbelievably audacious, so catastrophically violent, that it burns your name into the history books forever. For the Dark Brotherhood, this graduation from splinter cult to global boogeyman occurred in the year 430 of the Second Era. This brings us to a wonderfully obscure piece of lore that showcases the sheer, terrifying logistical capability of the early Brotherhood. The target was not a mere noble or a troublesome merchant. It was the Akaviri potentate, Severian Korak, the ruler of the Second Empire. But the Brotherhood did not just assassinate the potentate. In a display of synchronized slaughter that still baffles imperial historians, they assassinated Severian Korak and every single one of his heirs on the exact same night. Imagine the sheer scale of this operation. Without the aid of instantaneous magical communication or a localized telepathy spell, the Black Hand coordinated simultaneous, flawlessly lethal strikes across multiple provinces. Sentries were bypassed, magical wards were dismantled, and royal bloodlines were entirely extinguished before the sun even had a chance to rise. It was an apocalyptic night for the Empire, plunging Tamriel into a bloody, chaotic interregnum that lasted for centuries. It was the ultimate flex of power. The Brotherhood essentially stood over the corpse of the known world, dropped the bloody knife and whispered, "We can reach anyone." This historic, continent-shattering event cemented their reputation, but it also cemented their reliance on a central, unifying figure. The Black Hand could plot and scheme, but the spiritual core of the Brotherhood, the voice that supposedly handed down these impossible contracts, was the Night Mother. And the true identity of the Night Mother is the subject of one of the darkest, most enduring debates in the entire lore community. While some scholars still cling to the theory that she is the Daedric Prince Mephala in disguise, the Brotherhood's own internal mythology paints a much more intimate, disturbing picture. According to the Dark Elves and the historical texts found in the city of Bravil, the original Night Mother was a mortal Dunmer woman who lived during the Second Era. The story goes that she heard the whispering voice of Sithis in her mind, demanding blood. To appease the Dread Father, she systematically murdered her own 5 children, sacrificing their souls to the void. When the local townsfolk discovered this atrocity, they enacted brutal, vigilante justice, burning her house to the ground with her inside it. Fans constantly debate the historical validity of this Bravil ghost story. Is the Night Mother truly the spectral remains of a murderous mother? Or is this simply brilliant, morbid propaganda engineered by the Black Hand? Some lore enthusiasts point to conflicting accounts, suggesting the first Night Mother was actually a former leader of the Thieves' Guild, who realized that assassinations paid far better than petty burglary. In this theory, the murdered children are entirely metaphorical, representing the original Morag Tong tenets she had to destroy to create the Brotherhood. Yet, if you visit Bravil, there is an undeniable dark energy beneath the city. A hidden crypt beneath a prominent statue supposedly houses her remains. Then again, given the general state of Bravil, a city that essentially looks like a pile of wet, rotting driftwood held together entirely by despair and illicit skooma, sacrificing your children to a dark god might just be considered a proactive relocation strategy. Whether mortal woman, Daedric prince, or metaphorical myth, the Night Mother's presence within the Brotherhood is absolute. She is the anchor that prevents the cult from devolving into mindless, disorganized serial killers. By framing their murders as sacred rites directed by a loving, if deeply unhinged matriarch, the Brotherhood provides its members with a twisted sense of family. For the outcasts, the sociopaths, and the broken souls who find their way to a sanctuary, the Night Mother offers the one thing society denied them: unconditional, terrifying purpose. Within the damp, stone walls of a sanctuary, this purpose permeates everything. The air is always heavy with the smell of dried nightshade, old parchment, and polished leather. An assassin walks the halls, surrounded by brothers and sisters who share their chilling worldview. They attend sermons spoken by the speakers, pledging their blades to Sithis. The transition is complete. The legal safety net of Morrowind is forgotten, replaced by a fanatical thrill. When a Brotherhood assassin steps out into the night, they do not fear the guards, for they believe they are the physical manifestation of death itself. But theology and organization will only get you so far when you are staring down a heavily armored Imperial Guard captain in a locked keep. The ideological shift provided the motivation, and the Black Hand provided the targets, but the physical act of murder required a massive upgrade in methodology. If you are going to assassinate potentates and plunge entire empires into chaos, you can no longer rely on a rusty iron dagger and the hope that your target is a heavy sleeper. The Brotherhood's emergence necessitated an evolution in the tools of the trade. The art of the kill had to become a science. Alchemy, enchanting, and metallurgy became just as important as silent footsteps and dark prayers. The shadows had to be weaponized. To execute the perfect strike, an assassin needs instruments that are as silent, cold, and unforgiving as the void itself. The philosophy of death is fascinating, but it is the physical edge of the blade that actually severs the soul. Now that the cult is established and the contracts are flowing in, it is time we examined the lethal, ingenious arsenal that makes these nightmares a reality.
The ideology of the void provides the cold nerve required to take a life without hesitation. But philosophy alone cannot sever a carotid artery. To elevate murder from a messy, desperate struggle in the mud to a flawless, silent art form, the assassin must look beyond the crude iron daggers of their novice days. They must enter a world of bubbling retorts, specialized metallurgy, and shadows weaponized into physical steel. A sanctuary is not merely a dark subterranean temple, it is a laboratory of death, where the tools of the trade are forged, refined, and coated in pure malice. The air in the sanctuary's alchemy wing is always heavy, stinging the eyes with the acrid scent of crushed deathbell and the sickly sweet aroma of frost miriam. Here, the seasoned killer learns that a blade is often just a delivery mechanism. The true lethality lies in the viscous, shimmering liquid painted onto the edge. A core, undeniable reality for any prowler traversing Skyrim is the absolute power of a well-crafted paralysis poison. Mixing imp stool, Mora tapanella, and canis root creates a concoction that doesn't just damage the body, it instantly locks the victim's muscles in a terrifying, rigid state. The target is entirely aware as they freeze and topple over like a felled tree, helpless to cry out as the assassin steps calmly out of the gloom for the final strike. The process of discovering these potent alchemical recipes, however, is a hilariously grim affair. It is a well-documented phenomenon that aspiring alchemists in Tamriel tend to learn their craft by simply shoving raw, unwashed ingredients directly into their mouths to see what happens. It takes a very special, perhaps slightly unhinged kind of dedication to look at the severed, pungent toe of a giant or a handful of glowing, radioactive-looking vampire dust and think, yes, I should probably chew on this to discern its magical properties. It is a genuine wonder that half the Brotherhood doesn't perish from intense, supernatural food poisoning before they ever receive their first official contract. But there are some ingredients that command absolute respect, ingredients so unbelievably potent they are whispered about in the darkest corners of the underworld. Deep within the lore of Tamriel's deadliest botanicals lies the Jarrin Root. This exceedingly rare plant grows strictly on the island of Stros Mackay, far to the west. It is not something you stumble upon while casually picking mountain flowers in the pine forests of Falkreath. The Brotherhood procures it only for the most sensitive, historically significant contracts, usually those involving targets wrapped in silk, heavily guarded by the Penitus Oculatus, and dripping with imperial authority. The Jarrin Root contains a toxin so heavily concentrated that a single drop can stop a mortal heart before the victim even registers that their meal tasted slightly bitter. Its inclusion in a hearty stew or a polished red apple guarantees a clean, instantaneous kill. Of course, there's always that one overly curious assassin who, upon being handed the rarest, most lethal root in existence, decides to treat it like a common sweet roll and eats it straight out of their satchel just to see the effect. The result is a profoundly undignified, instantaneous ragdoll collapse onto the sanctuary floor, proving once and for all that while Sithis might be forgiving of your sins, acute botanical toxicity certainly is not. While a poisoned dagger is intimate, silent, and incredibly effective, the reality of Tamriel's heavily fortified keeps often necessitates a ranged approach. And here we must acknowledge a universal, almost cosmic truth of the Aurbis. It does not matter what noble path an adventurer sets out on. They could swear a blood oath to be a righteous, mace-wielding paladin of Stendar, or a scholarly mage dedicated solely to the restoration arts. Eventually, inevitably, they will find themselves crouching in the shadows of a damp cave, sniping a bandit from 100 yards away with a Daedric bow. The gravitational pull of the stealth archer is the true, inescapable black hole of the Elder Scrolls universe. The mechanics of the silenced arrow are a masterclass in physics and applied terror. A true assassin does not use the brightly fletched, heavy-shafted arrows of the Imperial Legion, which whistle loudly and clumsily as they cut through the air. They use arrows carved from lightweight bone or dark ebony, fletched with the soft, muted feathers of a hawk or an owl. When the bowstring is drawn back, it hums with a barely perceptible tension. The release is a soft thwip, followed by the wet, devastating thwack of the broadhead, finding its mark. The terror this instills in a group of patrolling guards is palpable. One moment they're complaining about the cold, the next, their comrade is pinned by the neck to a wooden support beam. They draw their swords and search the shadows in a panic, but the assassin has already relocated, leaving the surviving guards to nervously conclude that it must have just been the wind, despite the glass arrow protruding horizontally from their friend's skull. The absolute pinnacle of the Brotherhood's arsenal, the undisputed crown jewel of assassination, requires no arrows and no alchemy. It is a weapon that carries the heavy weight of history and the literal blessing of the void. We speak, of course, of the legendary Blade of Woe. This unique ebony dagger is the signature weapon of the Dark Brotherhood, passed down through the hands of its most esteemed leaders from Lucien Lachance in the waning days of the Third Era to Astrid in the frigid, isolated sanctuaries of the Fourth. The Blade of Woe is a terrifying piece of craftsmanship. It does not reflect the candlelight, it seems to absorb it, holding a deep, oily sheen along its wicked, asymmetrical curving edge, but its true power lies in its sinister enchantment. The blade does not just sever flesh and bone, it actively drinks the life force of the victim. When the dark ebony sinks into a target, the wielder feels a warm, sickeningly sweet rush of vitality flowing up the leather-wrapped hilt and into their own arm, knitting their own wounds together as the target rapidly bleeds out. It is a vampiric exchange, a physical manifestation of Sithis, reclaiming a soul while directly empowering his chosen instrument. The sheer terrifying power of the Blade of Woe has sparked one of the most fascinating and enduring debates among lore scholars and the fan community alike. The debate centers on the weapon's incredibly inconsistent nature across the eras. Fans have long pointed out a glaring historical discrepancy. When speaker Lucien Lachance first hands the Blade of Woe to a newly recruited assassin in Cyrodiil during the Oblivion Crisis, it is practically a useless, unenchanted butter knife. It acts as a ceremonial paperweight that only unlocks its true, soul-stealing potential after the wielder violently climbs the ranks of the Black Hand. Yet, 200 years later in Skyrim, Astrid wields it as a legendary, fully powered artifact. From the very moment you meet her, this mechanical discrepancy has birthed a popular lore theory that the Blade of Woe is not a single mundane physical dagger, but a Daedric artifact, perhaps a fragment of Mephalah's lingering power, or a direct, semi-sentient conduit to the Night Mother herself. The theory suggests the blade is entirely reflective of its wielder's connection to the void. It appears as a dull, heavy piece of junk to a novice, because they have not yet earned the right or the spiritual depth to channel its power. But to a true master or a sanctuary leader who has bathed in blood, it awakens, fiercely thirsting for souls. Some even theorize there are multiple Blades of Woe, forged from the ebony tears of the Night Mother, distributed among the various sanctuaries across Tamriel, waiting quietly in the dark for the right hand to grasp their hilts. Armed with paralyzing botanical toxins, silent shafts of feathered death, and an ebony dagger that literally drinks the souls of the unwary, our assassin is now a walking extinction event. The tools of the trade have been refined to an absolute, chilling perfection. They are cold to the touch, flawlessly balanced, and infinitely lethal. The transformation from a desperate novice clutching a rusted iron knife to a heavily armed instrument of the void is physically complete. However, even the most legendary blade and the deadliest Jarrin Root poison are entirely useless if the assassin cannot get close enough to use them. The physical tools are only half of the executioner's equation to bypass the watchful eyes of heavily armed guards, to cross brightly lit, highly paranoid courtyards, and to step into the most secure vaults in Tamriel entirely undetected. The assassin must look beyond the physical realm. They must reach out into the fragile, bending reality of the mind.
A blade painted with Jarrin Root can stop a heart in an instant, and a hawk-feathered arrow can pin a target to a timber frame from 100 yards away. But physical tools, no matter how exquisitely crafted or terrifyingly lethal, still obey the rigid laws of physics. They are bound by line of sight, the echo of leather boots against polished stone, and the unpredictable panic of a target who turns around at the wrong second. To achieve true perfection in the art of the kill, the assassin must look beyond the physical world and reach into the ambient, invisible threads of magicka that flow through the Aurbis. They must master the subtle, mind-bending art of illusion magic. In the sunlit halls of the College of Winterhold, scholars discuss the illusion school of magic in terms of perception, light manipulation, and psychological influence. They speak of it as an intellectual discipline used to calm terrified civilians or charm stubborn merchants into lowering their prices. But down in the damp, dark sanctuaries of the Brotherhood, illusion is not an academic pursuit. It is a terrifying weapon designed to break reality itself, just enough to slip a dagger between a man's ribs without the universe ever noticing. The fundamental spell in any Shadow Walker's repertoire is muffle. A novice assassin quickly learns that no matter how carefully they roll their weight from heel to toe, leather creaks, armor straps jingle, and dried leaves crunch underfoot. Muffle resolves this physical reality with a quiet flex of magicka. The spell creates an localized, shock-absorbing aura around the caster's feet, dampening every vibration, every scrape, and every footfall. The assassin could sprint full speed across a floor covered in dry autumn leaves or broken glass, and to the ears of a guard standing 2 feet away, the silence would be absolute. It is a surreal, almost floating sensation, moving through the world like a ghost long before you ever cross over into the void. Then comes the undisputed pinnacle of the illusion school, invisibility. To cast invisibility is to literally weave the light around your body, bending the photons,
or the ambient magicka of sun tears, as the ancient scholars would call it, so that it flows around you like water around a stone. You become a living distortion, a transparent draught of air. You can stand in the direct light of a chandelier in the imperial palace, looking directly into the face of a guard captain, and he will see only the tapestries hanging on the stone wall behind you. However, mastering invisibility in the heat of a contract reveals a hilariously frustrating paradox inherent to the magic system of Tamriel. A novice mage often thinks that casting invisibility makes them completely invincible. They wrap themselves in a shimmer of transparent light, sneak up behind a wealthy noble, and prepare to execute the perfect strike. But the moment their steel cuts into flesh, the spell shatters. The bright, sudden burst of magicka releasing from their hands as they initiate the attack lights up the room like a localized lightning bolt, instantly revealing them to every heavily armed guard in the room. It turns out that magical camouflage is exceedingly sensitive to violent physical acts. There is a deeply comedic tragedy in watching an overconfident novice instantly pop back into reality, crouching in broad daylight with a bloody dagger in hand, staring directly at three furious, mace-wielding orcs who were definitely not there a second ago. To overcome this fatal flaw, the master assassin must achieve a rare, highly specialized mental discipline known as quiet casting. This brings us to a core, well-established piece of in-game lore that transforms an amateur spellcaster into an unstoppable, silent phantom. Quiet casting is a perk within the illusion school that fundamentally alters how magicka interacts with the physical world. Under normal circumstances, casting a powerful spell, whether it is an invisibility spell, a healing glow, or a raging ball of fire, produces a distinct, resonant hum, a loud crackle of magical energy that alerts anyone nearby. Quiet casting entirely dampens this acoustic footprint. With quiet casting internalized, an assassin can stand in a dark corner, cast invisibility, muffle, and a paralyzing alteration ward in rapid succession, and not make a single sound. The air doesn't crackle, the magicka doesn't hum. The assassin becomes a completely silent engine of supernatural power. They can vanish into thin air while standing in a crowded tavern, step silently around a table, drop a frenzy spell into the mind of a patron, and watch the entire room erupt into a bloody brawl without a single soul realizing a spell was ever cast. This manipulation of the mind brings us to the psychological terror of the illusion school's offensive spells: frenzy, fear, and calm. These are not spells that inflict physical burns or deep lacerations. They are delicate, sinister needles that slide directly into the target's mind, tweaking their emotional dials to catastrophic effect. Consider the frenzy spell. An assassin infiltrating a heavily guarded fortress filled with 30 well-armed mercenaries does not need to fight their way through one by one. That is crude, noisy, and dangerous. Instead, the assassin crouches in the rafters, selects the largest, most terrifyingly equipped mercenary captain, and casts Quiet Frenzy. The spell travels through the air like an invisible, venomous whisper. It strikes the captain's mind, instantly obliterating his logic, his loyalty, and his sanity. He looks at his own men, sees terrifying monsters or ancient enemies, draws a massive battle axe, and begins screaming as he hacks his own comrades to pieces. The assassin simply sits quietly on a roof beam, eating a sweet roll, and watches the target's own guards do the heavy lifting. It is an extraordinary level of efficiency. Naturally, this terrifying power over the human psyche has sparked a massive, enduring debate within the fan community and among theoretical lore scholars. The debate centers on the exact nature of free will and identity in the presence of high-level illusion magic. If a master of illusion can step into a room and instantly force a devoted husband to attack his wife using frenzy, or force a bloodthirsty bandit chief to drop his weapons and weep in absolute terror using fear, or make a furious guard completely forgive a murderer on the spot using calm, do mortals in Tamriel truly possess free will, or are they all just organic puppets waiting for a mage to pull their mental strings? Some lore enthusiasts argue that illusion magic is the most inherently evil school of magic in existence, far surpassing necromancy. Necromancy merely desecrates a cold, unfeeling corpse that the soul has already departed. Illusion, however, violates the sacred sanctity of a living mind, stripping a person of their autonomy, their emotions, and their moral agency while they are still alive. To be forced by an unseen caster to murder your own brother while your conscious mind screams in horror inside your trapped skull is a fate far more terrifying than being raised as a skeleton to sweep a dungeon floor. Yet, for the Dark Brotherhood, this terrifying lack of mental autonomy is not a moral crisis, it is a primary asset. By bending the fragile minds of their targets, assassins eliminate the unpredictable human element that so often ruins a well-laid plan. They can force a paranoid target to walk out onto a secluded balcony, calm the guard standing at the door so he politely ignores the intruder, and then vanish into thin air before the body even hits the cobblestones below. The mastery of illusion elevates assassination from a physical feat of strength and stealth into a cerebral, almost terrifying game of psychological chess. The assassin no longer needs to worry about dirtying their boots in the mud or praying that a bandit doesn't hear a sword slipping from a scabbard. They control the lighting, the acoustics, and the emotional reality of the room. However, even with the ability to turn invisible, walk in absolute silence, and force guards to murder each other, the contract ultimately requires a physical resolution. Illusion creates the perfect opening, but it cannot sever the artery. The magic gets the assassin through the door, past the guards, and up to the bedside of the sleeping target. Now, the magic fades, the shadows hold their breath, and the cold, unyielding reality of steel meets flesh. To ensure that this final, physical contact results in instantaneous, absolute death, the assassin must move from the ethereal realm of the mind to the precise, brutal science of human anatomy. The spell of invisibility holds only as long as the world remains untouched. The moment the assassin reaches out to interact with the physical realm, to lift a heavy iron latch, to draw back a velvet curtain, or to sink a dagger into yielding flesh, the ethereal cloak shatters, dropping them violently back into the unforgiving reality of the physical world. Illusion magic is the silent carriage that delivers the killer to the bedside, but magic does not bleed a target. Magic does not snap a cervical vertebra. To execute the perfect strike, the assassin must step out of the abstract realm of magicka and embrace the precise, brutal, and highly intimate science of human anatomy. An assassin's relationship with the mortal body is fundamentally different from that of a warrior or a healer. A healer looks at a body and sees a delicate system of vital energies to be preserved. A warrior looks at a body and sees an obstacle to be battered down with brute force and heavy steel. But a master assassin looks at a body and sees a topographical map of fatal vulnerabilities. They see a fragile machine held together by a few critical tension points, knowing exactly which wire to snip to shut the entire system down instantly. After all, hacking away at a target with an iron broadsword like a skooma-addled mud crab in a tavern brawl might eventually get the job done, but it lacks elegance. It is incredibly noisy, it leaves an appalling mess on the tapestries, and it gives the target entirely too much time to scream for the city guard. The true artist of the void seeks the single, perfectly placed puncture. The goal is not merely to cause death, but to cause immediate, catastrophic biological failure. This brings us to a core, unassailable fact of Tamrielic physical laws, universally recognized by any shadow walker who has honed their craft to the absolute limit. It is a legendary technique known as the Assassin's Blade. Through grueling repetition and a profound understanding of kinetic leverage, a master of stealth can amplify the destructive force of a simple dagger strike by an astonishing 15 times its normal impact. It is the holy grail of physical combat in the shadows. A tiny, 3-inch blade of steel, when driven into the exact right millimeter of a target's anatomy from a position of total concealment, suddenly hits with the localized, devastating force of a falling boulder. But for the truly dedicated children of the Night Mother, a 15-fold increase is merely the baseline. To ascend to the absolute pinnacle of anatomical destruction, one must don the sacred vestments of the Dark Brotherhood. Here lies a fascinating, often overlooked piece of obscure lore regarding the Brotherhood's signature attire. The iconic shrouded gloves are not simply dyed leather designed to look intimidating. They are deeply enchanted artifacts woven with ancient shadow silk and imbued with a specific, localized kinetic amplifier. When an assassin wearing these gloves strikes a target in the back with a one-handed weapon, the ancient enchantment forcibly doubles the already massive physical trauma of the assassin's blade technique. This geometric explosion of lethality, the legendary 30 times damage multiplier, is the source of one of the most hotly contested fan theories in the Elder Scrolls community. Lore scholars and combat purists constantly argue over how, mathematically and physically, a tiny iron dagger can instantly drop a legendary elder dragon out of the sky just because the dragonborn happened to be crouching behind it. One camp insists that this multiplier is a literal, divine intervention by Sithis himself. They argue that when the shrouded gloves are worn and the strike is perfect, the void temporarily imbues the steel with an ontological weight, severing the target's thread of fate rather than just their flesh. The opposing camp, however, argues for pure, cold physics. They theorize that the 30-fold damage is simply the gameplay representation of an assassin successfully severing the brainstem. It doesn't matter if you have the health pool of a Daedric prince or armor thicker than a vault door. If a needle-thin blade slides perfectly between the base of the skull and the first vertebra, the central nervous system instantly collapses. In this view, the dagger isn't doing 30 times more magical damage, it's just bypassing the concept of health altogether by causing immediate, catastrophic brain death. Regardless of whether it is the hand of Sithis or the cold reality of the central nervous system, the execution of the strike requires flawless physical choreography. Let us return to our target, blissfully asleep in their grand bedchamber. The assassin stands over them, completely visible now, the invisibility spell allowed to gracefully dissipate into the cold night air. The breathing of the target is slow and rhythmic. The assassin must synchronize their own breathing to this rhythm, existing in the quiet spaces between the target's inhales and exhales. The left hand moves first. It is the anchor. It must shoot forward with blinding speed to clamp firmly over the target's mouth and jaw, simultaneously muffling any potential scream and violently wrenching the head backward and to the side. This sudden, forceful torque achieves two critical things. It induces a split second of paralyzing shock in the waking target, and it stretches the skin of the neck taut, exposing the vital pathways beneath the jawline. The right hand, gripping the dagger, does not slash. Slashing the jugular vein, while dramatic and heavily featured in cheap imperial romance novels, is surprisingly inefficient. It creates an enormous, spraying mess that ruins the assassin's boots, and the target can still thrash and make noise for agonizing, chaotic seconds before the blood pressure drops entirely. Instead, the right hand thrusts. The master assassin aims for the soft hollow just behind the collarbone, the subclavian artery, or, for an even faster resolution, they drive the point upward through the base of the skull directly into the medulla oblongata. Of course, this pristine textbook execution relies on the target having a standard, accessible neck. Tamriel is a diverse continent, and this rich diversity often translates into massive anatomical headaches for an aspiring assassin. Trying to find the precise pulse point on a Khajiit is a nightmare because their thick, luxurious fur effectively masks the subtle throb of the carotid artery. Attempting a rapid neck snap on an Argonian often ends in a loud, embarrassing crunch as your dagger snaps against their rigid cervical scales. And let us not even speak of the absolute absurdity of trying to assassinate a paranoid target who sleeps in a full set of dwarven armor. You spend 10 minutes standing over their bed in the pitch black, gently prodding at brass interlocking plates, feeling less like a lethal instrument of the void and more like a confused locksmith trying to dismantle a hostile, snoring puzzle box. Assuming the target is mercifully unarmored, the blade sinks home. The physical sensation for the assassin is deeply jarring. There is a sudden, heavy resistance of muscle and cartilage, followed by a sickening, hollow pop as the blade breaches the vital cavity. The sound the target makes is never the poetic, tragic gasp of a dying hero. It is an undignified, wet gurgle. When the lungs instantly lose their bellows-like pressure, the air simply rushes out of the nose and throat in a low, continuous hiss. Honestly, it sounds remarkably like a leather water skin slowly deflating in the corner of a quiet room. It is a thoroughly unimpressive sound to accompany the end of a vast, complex human life. The final, and perhaps most crucial, anatomical phase of the perfect strike is the descent. The moment the central nervous system is destroyed, the target's body instantly transitions from a rigid structure of tense muscles into a spectacularly heavy, dead weight. If the assassin simply lets go, the corpse will hit the floorboards with a thunderous, echoing crash that will instantly alert every guard within a 50-yard radius. The master killer must absorb this sudden influx of dead weight. The left hand, still clamped over the mouth, becomes a pulley. The right hand withdraws the blade with a smooth, twisting motion to prevent suction, and immediately drops to support the victim's collapsing torso. The assassin essentially embraces the corpse, bending their own knees, slowly lowering the lifeless mass to the stone floor in absolute silence. It is a morbid, grotesque dance, a final, incredibly intimate waltz between the killer and the killed. When the body is finally at rest on the floor, pooling blood silently soaking into the fine rugs, the physical act is complete. The assassin straightens up, wiping the blackened edge of the dagger on a clean patch of the victim's silk sheets. The frantic, booming sound of the assassin's own heartbeat in their ears begins to slow, merging back into the quiet, ambient hum of the dark room. This is the anatomy of the perfect strike. It is a triumph of physics, patience, and a chilling disregard for the sanctity of the mortal form. But while anyone can learn to slide a knife between a set of ribs with enough practice, there are some who do not need to learn. There are some who are simply born to it. While the assassins of Cyrodiil and Skyrim must spend years studying anatomical charts and practicing in the shadows, deep in the sweltering, impenetrable swamps of Black Marsh, the perfect killers are hatched, not made. To truly understand the absolute apex of biological lethality, we must look to the south, to the murky waters of Argonia, and to the chilling, ancient tradition of the Shadowborn. We must leave the cold, sterile stone of that murdered noble's bedchamber behind us now. The shivering frost of Skyrim and the crisp, civilized air of Cyrodiil fade, replaced by a sweltering, oppressive humidity that clings to the skin like a wet woolen blanket. Imagine the air growing incredibly thick, heavy with the scent of decaying vegetation, blooming death bells, and the rich, metallic tang of deep, stagnant water. You are standing on the edge of the deepest, most impenetrable swamps of Black Marsh, the enigmatic province of the Argonians. Here, the shadows do not merely hide in the corners of a room, they are a living, breathing part of the ecosystem, and in this murky, hostile environment, the art of assassination is not a learned skill, it is a birthright. For an aspiring human or elven killer, mastering the physical strike and the ethereal nuances of illusion magic takes decades of grueling, nerve-wracking practice. But for a very specific sect of Argonians, the path of the blade is laid out before they even break out of their shells. This brings us to a fundamental, terrifying core fact of in-game lore. Any Argonian hatched in Black Marsh under the astrological sign of the Shadow is immediately taken from their family and given directly to the Dark Brotherhood. Just take a moment to really process the sheer, unadulterated administrative efficiency of this cultural practice. You do not have to worry about recruiting angst-ridden teenagers or disgraced soldiers. You simply consult an astrological calendar, pluck an egg from the warming mud, and say, "Congratulations, little lizard. You are destined to be a high-functioning sociopath with a penchant for throat-slitting." It certainly takes the pressure off deciding what to major in at the local bard's college. There is no fumbling with career choices in the swamp. You are either a humble mudcrab fisher, or you are a state-sponsored harbinger of death. These shadowborn hatchlings are raised together, forged in the brutal, unforgiving environment of the deep marsh. They are known as the Shadowscales. To face a fully grown Shadowscale is to face a biological killing machine perfectly adapted to the art of the ambush. An ordinary assassin must cast muffle to quiet their heavy leather boots. An Argonian simply slips off their foot wraps and pads silently on scaled, digitigrade feet that naturally absorb the shock of their movement. Furthermore, the environmental versatility of a Shadowscale makes them an absolute nightmare to track or evade. If a human assassin botches a contract in a heavily guarded port city, their escape routes are strictly limited to the rooftops or the alleys. If a Shadowscale is compromised on the docks of Solitude or Anvil, they simply dive backward off the pier and vanish beneath the icy waves. Trying to drown an Argonian assassin is a spectacularly embarrassing rookie mistake. They possess gills that allow them to breathe underwater indefinitely, meaning they can wait out a citywide manhunt, sitting perfectly still at the bottom of a harbour, having a quiet snack on some kelp, while the guards above scream themselves hoarse. Add to this their natural biological resistance to toxins. An alchemist in a Brotherhood sanctuary might accidentally poison themselves by chewing on a Jarrin Root, but trying to poison a Shadowscale is generally an exercise in futility. You are attempting to introduce foreign toxins into a creature whose blood is already composed of roughly 90% stagnant swamp water, raw spite, and hissed sap. They are incredibly difficult to kill and effortlessly proficient at returning the favour. One does have to wonder, however, about their traditional naming conventions. A stealth operative named Hides in Shadows, or Stabs You Quietly, feels a bit too on the nose for a clandestine organisation. But perhaps the sheer terror they inspire excuses a lack of subtlety in their nomenclature. While their affiliation with the Dark Brotherhood is legendary, their true purpose and history within Black Marsh are far more complex than simple cultish devotion. Here we uncover an obscure, deeply fascinating piece of lore regarding their training and early operational deployment. Before a Shadowscale is fully integrated into the global, Sithis worshipping network of the Dark Brotherhood, they are trained in a heavily fortified, deeply secretive facility located near the Argonian city of Archon. In this primordial training ground, they do not just learn to kill for the void, they learn to serve their homeland. Historically, before being offered to the Brotherhood at large, Shadowscales served as the personal assassins and enforcers for the King of Black Marsh. They were an integrated, heavily feared branch of the Argonian royal court. If a rival clan grew too ambitious, or an imperial diplomat overstepped their bounds in the province, a Shadowscale was dispatched to quietly, efficiently correct the political imbalance. In this sense, they operated much like the Morag Tong of Morrowind, serving as a lethal, state-sanctioned scalpel. However, the political landscape of Tamriel is a fragile, ever-shifting thing, and the fate of the Shadowscales in the Fourth Era is one of the most hotly contested fan theories in the Elder Scrolls community. By the time the Dragonborn wanders into the dark, damp sanctuary in Skyrim, the Brotherhood is a crumbling, pathetic shadow of its former glory. And within that sanctuary, we meet Visara, an Argonian who solemnly claims to be the very last of the Shadowscales. He states that the tradition has died, the training grounds are empty, and his brethren are extinct. But lore scholars and fans aggressively debate the truth of this extinction. Did the Shadowscales truly die out? One massive theory points to the rise of the An-Zilil, a violently xenophobic, fiercely nationalistic political faction that seized total control of Black Marsh during the Oblivion Crisis. The An-Zilil are notoriously isolationist and deeply tied to the ancient, sentient Hist trees. The theory suggests that the An-Zilil viewed the Dark Brotherhood, a foreign, imperial-centric cult, as a corrupting influence on their people. In this scenario, the An-Zilil didn't just let the Shadowscale tradition fade, they actively, brutally purged them from the province to sever ties with the outside world. Conversely, an equally popular theory argues for a far more masterful, stealthy conclusion. Fans propose that the Shadowscales, possessing unparalleled skills in evasion and espionage, simply saw the writing on the wall. They recognized that the Dark Brotherhood was a sinking ship, riddled with internal betrayal and gross incompetence. So, what does the greatest faction of assassins in the world do when their corporate parent company starts failing? They fake their own extinction. They sever their ties, burn their own records, and melt back into the impenetrable swamps of Black Marsh, returning to the exclusive service of the Hist. In this view, Visara isn't the last Shadowscale. He is just the only one left who is foolish enough to still wear the Brotherhood's armor. It is the ultimate stealth maneuver, assassinating your own historical footprint. Regardless of whether they are truly extinct or merely hiding in the deepest bogs of Argonia, The tragedy of the Shadowscale is deeply palpable. Their existence is a somber reminder of the absolute lack of autonomy in the world of high-level assassination. For a human or elf, walking the path of shadows is a choice. It is a dark, terrible choice, often driven by trauma, greed, or madness. But it is a choice nonetheless. A Shadowscale never had the luxury of free will. Their fate was sealed the moment the stars aligned over their egg. They are weapons forged by astrology, honed by the swamp, and pointed at the heart of the world by a dark god they did not choose to worship. Imagine the psychological weight of that existence. A Shadowscale stands in the rain, the drops sliding harmlessly off their dense scales. They feel no cold, no fear, and no hesitation. They execute a target with the flawless, mechanical perfection of a being completely stripped of mortal doubt. They do not feel the terrifying intimacy of the kill that our novice assassin felt in the freezing mud of Skyrim. They feel only the completion of a function. They are the void made flesh, a localized anomaly of entropy shaped into a bipedal reptile. Yet, for all their biological advantages and flawless training, the world of Tamriel is heavily fortified. Being able to breathe underwater and walk in absolute silence is magnificent, but it does not magically phase your physical body through a 3-foot-thick wall of solid granite. A target who knows they are hunted does not sleep in an open plaza. They retreat into the earth. They surround themselves with paranoid mercenaries, impenetrable dwarven metal, and complex magical wards. As we drift away from the buzzing flesh flies and the murky depths of Black Marsh, we must acknowledge that the perfect killer needs more than just the perfect weapon and a quiet footstep. The true test of an assassin's mastery is not just the strike itself, but the arduous, deeply dangerous puzzle of the approach. It is time to leave the wilderness behind and look to the colossal fortresses of stone and steel that dot the landscape. The blade is thirsty, the shadows are deep. But first, we must figure out how to pick a master-level lock without snapping our only lockpick and waking up half the continent. The biological perfection of a Shadowscale and the mind-bending reality of illusion magic are magnificent assets, but they ultimately mean very little if the target is sitting behind 3 feet of reinforced steel and solid granite. As we leave the sweltering, primordial swamps of Black Marsh and return to the cold, civilized architecture of Tamriel, we confront a harsh physical reality. Paranoia is a wealthy man's greatest defense. A king who knows a bounty is on his head does not sleep with the windows open. He retreats into the earth. He surrounds himself with heavy stone, intricate locking mechanisms, and a small army of heavily caffeinated guards. For the master assassin, the kill itself is often the easiest part of the contract. The true nightmare is simply getting into the room. To infiltrate an unreachable target, the assassin must develop a profound, almost romantic intimacy with architecture. The shadows offer concealment, but they do not provide a physical pass-through. The prowler must become a phantom of the physical world, slipping through the smallest cracks in the perimeter. This begins with the quiet, maddening science of the lockpick. Consider the sensation of kneeling before a massive, iron-bound oak door in the dead of night. The air is freezing, biting at your knuckles. You draw a slender, fragile sliver of iron from your leather pouch. This is a core, universally experienced mechanical reality for any shadow walker in Tamriel. The delicate, high-tension dance of the tumbler. The assassin applies rotational pressure with a tension wrench, feeling the subtle give of the ancient metal. The pick slides into the keyhole, seeking that microscopic sweet spot. It is a game of sensory deprivation. You cannot see the pins, you can only feel the vibrations traveling up the thin iron shaft and listen for the distinct, heavy click of a tumbler setting into place. Of course, the path of the lockpick is paved with profound, soul-crushing indignity. There is a universal, incredibly frustrating rite of passage that every rogue must endure, spending 15 minutes crouching in a damp, freezing dungeon, snapping 40 fragile iron lockpicks in a row on a stubbornly complex master-level chest, sweating profusely while praying the guards don't hear you cursing. And when that glorious final click finally echoes through the stone, and the heavy lid creaks open, what do you find? A single, mouldy carrot, a minor potion of stamina, and 12 gold coins. It is a level of anticlimax so profound, It makes you question your entire career path, but a true assassin simply sighs, pockets the carrot, and moves on. To bypass this mechanical frustration, the highest echelons of the underworld seek out artifacts of immense supernatural power. The ultimate tool of physical infiltration is an item so legendary it commands the reverence of the Thieves' Guild and the Dark Brotherhood alike. The Skeleton Key. An artifact of Nocturnal, the Daedric Prince of Shadows, the Skeleton Key is not a fragile piece of iron. It is a flawlessly crafted tool of the void that simply does not break. It glides through the most intricate, heavily warded tumblers like a hot knife through butter, rendering the concept of a locked door entirely obsolete. The sheer power of this artifact has sparked one of the most fascinating and heavily debated fan theories in the lore community. The debate centers around the true, metaphysical capabilities of the key. During the chaotic events involving the Thieves' Guild in the Fourth Era, the rogue Mercer Frey steals the key and claims it does far more than just open wooden doors. He claims it can unlock hidden potential. Fans constantly argue over the exact nature of this claim. Is the Skeleton Key a literal, reality-bending Daedric tool that can unlock abstract, metaphysical concepts? Could an assassin use it to unlock a target's mind, bypassing their sanity? Could it unlock a dormant magical reservoir within the wielder, or even unlock a tear in the fabric of space and time to create an instant escape route? The opposing camp argues that this is giving the artifact way too much credit. They suggest that Mercer Frey was just an incredibly arrogant, theatrical rogue waxing poetic to sound intimidating, and the key is just a really, really good lockpick that saves you from carrying 80 pieces of scrap iron. Whether it bends reality or just saves your inventory space, its existence proves that for the master infiltrator, a lock is merely a suggestion. But what happens when you encounter a door that does not have a keyhole at all? Tamriel is littered with the ruins of the Dwemer, the ancient, deeply paranoid Deep Elves who entirely rejected traditional mechanics in favor of something far more complex. Here we uncover an obscure, highly technical piece of lore regarding Dwemer tonal architecture. The most secure vaults in Dwemer ruins are sealed not by tumblers and pins, but by tonal locks. These doors are bound by the harmonic resonance of the universe itself. To bypass a tonal lock, an assassin cannot use a pick or a tension wrench. They must produce a specific acoustic frequency that resonates perfectly with the brass and stone, tricking the architecture into shifting its state. It is a deeply humbling experience. Imagine being a master assassin, clad in enchanted dark leather, coated in lethal poisons, entirely invisible to the naked eye, and you are completely stopped in your tracks by a brass door because you forgot to bring your acoustic tuning fork, or because you never learned how to hum a perfect B-flat in the exact resonant frequency of the room. It proves that true infiltration requires a scholarly mind just as much as a steady hand. Let us assume, however, that the lock has been bypassed. The heavy oak door swings open on freshly oiled hinges, silent as a ghost. The assassin steps over the threshold and into the compound. Now, the mechanical puzzle is replaced by the human element. The fortress is alive. It breathes in the slow, rhythmic pacing of armed sentries. It glares with the harsh, flickering light of wall sconces and braziers. Infiltration at this level is a fluid, terrifying ballet. The assassin does not look at the guards. They look at the cones of vision. They watch the shadows cast by the torches, calculating how the darkness stretches and shrinks as a guard walks past a brazier. The master prowler knows that light is liquid. They stick to the walls where the illumination pools thin and weak. They time their movements to the environmental noise. A crack of thunder outside, the raucous laughter from the guard barracks below, the rhythmic clatter of rain against the stained glass windows. These are the auditory cloaks that mask the soft thud of a leather boot. Sometimes, the environment must be actively manipulated to create a blind spot. A true professional rarely engages a guard unless absolutely necessary, as corpses are notoriously difficult to hide quickly and tend to arouse intense suspicion. Instead, the assassin uses misdirection. An arrow fired quietly into a wooden barrel on the opposite side of the courtyard. The clatter of a single gold coin tossed onto a stone staircase. The guards turn, their attention entirely funneled toward the false stimulus. and the assassin glides effortlessly behind their backs, slipping through the momentary tear in their security perimeter. And yet, no matter how flawless the assassin's technique, the entire operation can be catastrophically ruined by the company they keep. This is another grimly humorous reality of navigating Tamriel. You can spend an hour carefully plotting a completely silent, invisible route through a dungeon, mapping out every trap and sentry line. You begin your flawless approach, only for your heavily armored, fiercely loyal housecarl to loudly crunch an apple, draw a massive glowing broadsword, and aggressively step on a highly visible pressure plate, immediately triggering an ancient, ceiling-mounted fireball trap. Sometimes, the true enemy to a perfect infiltration isn't the target's security detail, it's the chaotic, incredibly loud enthusiasm of your own followers. The solitary nature of the assassin is not just a stylistic choice, it is an absolute survival requirement. As the assassin leaves their clumsy companions behind and ascends deeper into the target's keep, the tension grows thick enough to cut with a glass dagger. The outer perimeter is breached, the inner patrols are bypassed. The final, heavy wooden door of the master suite looms ahead. The target lies within, completely oblivious, secure in the false belief that their wealth and their stone walls have made them immortal. The assassin rests a gloved hand on the latch. The infiltration is complete. The physical world has been conquered, its locks picked, its guards fooled, its light manipulated. But before the blade is drawn, before the final, bloody transaction occurs, the mind must be readied. The master assassin does not just kill for coin, they kill to appease a voice. As the door opens and the sleeping target comes into view, the silence of the room is not entirely empty. In the darkest corners of the mind, a chilling, maternal whisper begins to echo. The physical strike is imminent, but first, we must listen to the cold, maddening embrace of the matron who guides the blade. The heavy oak door of the master suite clicks shut with a finality that swallows the ambient noise of the fortress whole. The assassin stands perfectly still in the dark, the target's slow, rhythmic breathing the only sound in the room. The physical infiltration is over. The wards are bypassed, the guards are chasing shadows in the courtyard, and the lock has been gracefully defeated. Yet, as the killer draws that cold, soul-drinking ebony dagger, the silence of the room is not entirely empty. For the true masters of the Dark Brotherhood, those who have ascended to the absolute pinnacle of the organization, a kill is never a solitary act. Before the blade falls, the mind must quiet itself to listen, and in the darkest corners of that mental silence, a chilling ancient whisper begins to echo. To understand the psychological state of an apex assassin in Tamriel, we must confront a deeply unsettling core reality of the Dark Brotherhood's leadership. The organization is not commanded by a living mortal. It is directed by the Night Mother, and her physical form is not some glorious, glowing, ethereal spirit that floats gracefully through the halls of a subterranean temple. She is, quite literally, a remarkably crisp, terrifyingly fragile, mummified corpse, housed inside a colossal, iron-bound coffin. The title of Listener is the highest honor a Brotherhood assassin can achieve, but the physical reality of the job is incredibly macabre. The Night Mother does not broadcast her contracts to the entire sanctuary. She speaks only to the listener, and she does not do so from afar. When the unholy matron has a contract to deliver, the listener must physically approach the Iron Maiden, unlatch the heavy metal doors, and lean in close to the desecrated, skeletal remains. They must embrace the cold, leathery husk of a woman dead for centuries, feeling the absolute, freezing void radiate from her sunken eye sockets, as her voice manifests directly inside their skull. It is a voice that defies acoustic reality. It does not travel through the air. It drips into the mind like freezing water sliding down a cave wall. It is maternal, yes, but devoid of any mortal warmth. She calls her assassins child, but it is the terrifying affection of a spider wrapping a freshly caught fly in silk. To hear her speak is to have your own sanity aggressively tested. And then there is the sheer, logistical nightmare of her existence. One must take a moment to appreciate the absurd comedy of transporting the Night Mother across provincial borders. Imagine being the keeper, the poor soul tasked with her physical protection, trying to explain to a paranoid Imperial customs officer at the Pale Pass border crossing why you are hauling a massive 500-pound Iron Maiden that smells faintly of decay and lavender in the back of a rickety wooden wagon. Oh, this, just a heavily reinforced antique grandfather clock, Sergio. Family heirloom. Please ignore the ominous whispering coming from the keyhole. It is a miracle the Brotherhood manages to relocate her at all, without alerting every paladin and vigilant within 100 miles. The physical maintenance of the Night Mother brings us to a wonderfully obscure, deeply unsettling piece of in-game lore hidden within the frantic, scribbled journals of Cicero, her most infamous keeper. While the assassins are out practicing their blade work and brewing poisons, the keeper is essentially running a subterranean, highly exclusive day spa for a corpse. Cicero's journals detail the exhaustive, incredibly gross daily maintenance required to keep the unholy matron from simply crumbling into a pile of haunted dust. The keeper must meticulously apply a specific concoction of oils to her mummified flesh to keep the ancient leather supple. They must gently scrape away the natural rot and the creeping damp of the sanctuary walls from her brittle bones. They must bathe her in embalming fluids and burn specific incenses to mask the overpowering stench of centuries-old death. It is an incredibly unglamorous reality for an elite, world-feared murder cult. You join the Dark Brotherhood dreaming of rooftop assassinations and political intrigue, and instead, you end up on latrine duty, tasked with vigorously moisturizing a 200-year-old murder jerky. Yet, for all this grotesque physical upkeep, her spiritual presence is absolute. The Night Mother is the undisputed anchor of the Brotherhood, the conduit to Sithis, but her leadership style is, at best, entirely enigmatic, and at worst, actively hostile to her own children. This brings us to a massive, heavily debated fan theory that has divided lore scholars for years: the pruning theory. Throughout the history of the Elder Scrolls games, from the Oblivion Crisis to the Civil War in Skyrim, the Dark Brotherhood sanctuaries have a terrible habit of being catastrophically compromised, invaded, and burned to the ground, resulting in the brutal deaths of almost every member inside. Fans constantly debate a glaring question. If the Night Mother is a semi-omniscient, immensely powerful psychic entity who can hear the whispers of anyone performing the Black Sacrament anywhere in Tamriel, why does she never warn her own children when the city guard is about to kick the sanctuary door down? The pruning theory suggests that this silence is entirely intentional. It proposes that the Night Mother views the Brotherhood not as a fragile family to be protected, but as an overgrown garden that occasionally requires a brutal pruning to remain strong. When a sanctuary becomes complacent, when a leader like Astrid in Skyrim turns her back on the old ways and tries to run the cult like a mundane mercenary guild, the Night Mother simply withdraws her protection. She allows the Penitus Oculatus, or the local authorities, to slaughter the weak, the disloyal, and the stagnant. She lets the sanctuary burn to the ground, knowing that only the strongest, most fanatically devoted assassin, the true listener, will survive the ashes to rebuild the cult in her exact, terrifying image. It is the ultimate, toxic management strategy. I noticed office morale was low, and adherence to the 5 tenets was slipping, so I orchestrated a heavily armed raid by the Imperial Legion to build character. Only the survivors get a promotion. Whether she is genuinely omniscient and cruel, or simply a limited spectral entity, incapable of seeing immediate physical danger, the result is the same. To follow the Night Mother is to accept that your life is entirely expendable, a temporary tool to be used and discarded the moment your edge begins to dull. But tonight, in this freezing master suite, the edge is razor sharp. The assassin standing over the sleeping noble is not a discarded tool. They are the active, terrifying manifestation of the matron's will. The psychic connection crackles in the quiet room. The assassin closes their eyes, letting the memory of the Night Mother's cold embrace wash over them. The scent of the keeper's embalming oils and old dust fills their phantom senses, masking the smell of the target's expensive perfumes. The voice whispers in the skull, soft and commanding. It does not offer tactical advice. It does not tell the assassin where to strike. It merely demands the soul. It is a chilling validation of the horrific act about to occur. The assassin is no longer a mortal committing a crime. They are a priest, performing a holy sacrament. The assassin's eyes snap open, The hesitation that plagues lesser killers, the sudden rush of adrenaline, the moral panic, the fear of consequence, is entirely eradicated by the cold, heavy blanket of the void. The assassin's breathing sinks with the sleeping target once more. The left hand clamps down with bone-crushing force over the mouth, snapping the head back to expose the pale, vulnerable throat. The right hand drives the ebony blade upward into the base of the skull. There is the hollow pop of the spine yielding, the sudden, deflating hiss of air from the target's nostrils, the heavy warm rush of the Blade of Woe violently draining the life force, knitting a small scrape on the assassin's arm as the noble's body goes completely limp. The assassin lowers the dead weight to the floor with agonizing slowness, absorbing the impact, ensuring not a single floorboard groans in protest. As the target's blood begins to pool silently on the intricate rugs, the assassin kneels, bowing their head. The psychic link to the iron coffin pulses one final time, a cold wave of maternal approval washing over the killer's mind. The contract is fulfilled. The Night Mother is appeased. This silent psychic communion is the true hallmark of the Brotherhood's highest rank. But while the Night Mother delivers the contracts in the dark, the contracts themselves do not simply materialize out of thin air. For the matron to whisper a name, someone, somewhere in the world, had to scream it into the void first. The perfect strike is the end of the transaction, but to understand the full, terrifying economy of death in Tamriel, we must look to the beginning. We must examine the desperate, blood-soaked ritual that summons the Brotherhood from the shadows. The deed is done, the target is cold, but the dark magic that sealed this fate was cast long before the assassin ever drew their blade. The deed is done in the dark, but the machinery that puts the blade in the assassin's hand always grinds to life in the desperate, flickering light of a candle-lit cellar. As our master assassin steps gracefully over the cooling corpse of the noble, wiping the ebony dagger clean, we must rewind the clock. Long before the Night Mother whispered her chilling command, long before the lock was picked or the invisibility spell was cast, someone had to set the universe in motion. The perfect strike is merely the violent conclusion of a transaction. To understand the true, terrifying economy of death in Tamriel, we must look at how one actually goes about hiring the most feared murder cult in history. You cannot simply walk into a tavern in Skyrim, slap a bag of septims on the bar, and ask the barkeep if he knows a guy who knows a guy. The Dark Brotherhood does not have a customer service desk, nor do they run localized advertisements in the Black Horse Courier. To summon a child of Sithis, a petitioner must bypass the mundane channels of commerce and engage directly with the dark, metaphysical bureaucracy of the void. They must perform the Black Sacrament. This brings us to a core, unassailable fact of in-game lore that firmly establishes the Brotherhood as a cult rather than a mere mercenary company. The Black Sacrament is not a casual prayer. It is a macabre, highly specific, and profoundly illegal blood ritual. To even begin, the petitioner must construct an effigy of their intended victim, but this is not some simple straw doll or a crude wooden carving. The effigy must be composed of actual, harvested human remains. Imagine the sheer, visceral horror of the setup. A desperate citizen, driven mad by grief, betrayal, or burning ambition, locks themselves in a damp basement. They arrange a circle of candles on the cold stone floor. Inside that circle, they must place a human skull, human flesh, and a human heart. They must then take an iron dagger, rub the blade with the petals of the poisonous nightshade flower, and repeatedly stab the grotesque effigy while chanting a very specific, chilling incantation. Sweet Mother, send your child unto me, for the sins of the unworthy must be baptized in blood and fear. Let us pause for a moment to appreciate the sheer, logistical nightmare this presents for the average Tamrielic citizen. It takes a profound level of dedication to execute this ritual. You do not simply stroll down to the bustling market square in Whiterun, approach the local vegetable stall and say, "Yes, I'd like 3 leeks, a sack of potatoes, and 1 fresh human heart, please. Oh, and do you have any nightshade in the back?" Sourcing these ingredients requires a citizen to commit several high-level felonies before the assassin even arrives. You have to assume there is either a highly lucrative, deeply hidden black market for Sacrament starter kits, or the graveyards of Tamriel are constantly being raided by disgruntled merchants and spurned lovers armed with shovels and a terrible sense of purpose. Given the intense secrecy of the Brotherhood, one might wonder how a commoner even knows the precise steps of this horrific ritual. Here, we uncover an obscure, deeply fascinating piece of lore regarding the dissemination of forbidden knowledge. The entire, step-by-step process of the Black Sacrament is detailed in a surprisingly common, yet heavily banned book titled A Kiss, Sweet Mother. What is truly bizarre about this text is its ubiquitous presence across the continent. It is essentially Assassination for Dummies, a literal DIY guide to contacting a supernatural death cult, yet you can frequently find copies just lying around on the bedside tables of cozy inns, tucked into the bookshelves of local jarls, or sitting openly on the desks of the Arcaneum at the College of Winterhold. It is a spectacular failure of imperial censorship. The guards will aggressively confiscate a stolen sweet roll, but they will apparently turn a blind eye to a highly illegal, mass-produced pamphlet that teaches angry civilians how to summon a demonic hitman. The psychological toll of performing the sacrament is immense. It acts as a brutal natural filter. A person might idly wish for their rival to drop dead over a pint of mead, but the moment they find themselves in a freezing cellar at 3 a.m, holding a nightshade-coated dagger over a decaying human heart, the reality of their desire is severely tested. If they can plunge the blade down and chant the words without breaking, their soul is already half claimed by the void. The ritual creates a localized tear in the spiritual fabric of the world, a beacon of pure, concentrated malice that shoots straight through the ether, bypassing the divines entirely, and lands directly in the iron coffin of the Night Mother. But the mechanics of this supernatural inbox have sparked one of the most enduring, morbidly fascinating fan theories in the Elder Scrolls community. The debate centers around a young boy named Aventus Aretino, found in the snowy city of Windhelm. When the Dragonborn discovers Aventus, he is a literal child, locked in his family home, aggressively performing the Black Sacrament to call a hit on a cruel orphanage headmistress. The fan community immediately zeroed in on 2 glaring questions. First, how on Nirn did a 10-year-old boy get his hands on a human skull, human flesh, and a human heart while locked inside a city house? The most popular and deeply disturbing fan theory suggests that Aventus harvested the parts from his own recently deceased mother. It adds a layer of tragic, unfathomable darkness to his character, transforming him from a naive child into a traumatized boy who literally butchered his only parent to summon an assassin. A secondary, slightly less horrific theory suggests that Calixto Corium, Windhelm's resident serial killer who runs a museum of oddities down the street, secretly supplied the boy with the macabre ingredients, amused by the child's dark ambition. The second major debate surrounding Aventus revolves around the Night Mother's actual capabilities. At the time Aventus is performing the ritual, the Dark Brotherhood in Skyrim does not have a listener. The Night Mother has been silent for years. Because of this, Aventus has been locked in his house, chanting the same phrase over and over, stabbing the effigy for weeks on end. It highlights a massive flaw in the Brotherhood's business model. If the Night Mother is the only one who can hear the sacrament, and she has no listener to relay the message, the prayers just pile up in a cosmic queue. And the local authorities? The guards of Windhelm provide a spectacularly humorous example of bureaucratic apathy. If you walk past the Aretino residence before breaking in, you can literally hear the guards and local citizens complaining about the chanting. Yeah, the kid has been loudly performing a legendary, illegal blood ritual to summon a death cult for the past month. But the door is locked, and honestly, it's not my jurisdiction. Best to just ignore it. It is a staggering display of negligence that makes you wonder how the city hasn't been completely overrun by Daedra. Eventually, however, the cosmic signal connects. A listener is chosen, the message is passed down, and the Black Hand points its lethal finger. But the assassin does not immediately travel to the target. The first visit is to the petitioner. This meeting is a surreal, chilling inversion of power. The petitioner has spent days trembling in the dark, surrounded by rotting meat, praying for a monster to arrive. And then, Usually when they have finally given up hope, they turn around, and the monster is just standing there. Imagine the awkwardness of the assassin, entirely invisible and muffled, slipping into the cellar and just quietly standing in the corner for 5 minutes, while the exhausted civilian finishes their dramatic, tear-filled chanting, waiting for a polite moment to clear their throat and say, "So, I hear you have a gold problem that requires a steel solution." The assassin arrives not as a mindless killer, but as a supernatural debt collector. They are the physical manifestation of consequence. The terms are negotiated in hushed whispers. The price is always exorbitant, often entirely wiping out the petitioner's life savings, but the cost is more than just coin. When the petitioner hands over the heavy purse of septims, they are sealing a spiritual pact. The gold goes to the sanctuary, but the guilt, the karmic weight of the murder, is shared forever between the one who ordered the strike and the one who executes it. Once the contract is sealed, the assassin vanishes back into the shadows. The petitioner is left alone in the dark with the rotting effigy and the terrifying realization that they have set a machine in motion that cannot be stopped. There are no refunds in the Dark Brotherhood. There is no calling off the hit because you had a change of heart. Once the Night Mother has spoken and the gold has changed hands, the target is already dead. Their body simply hasn't caught up with the paperwork yet. And so, the cycle completes itself. From the desperation of a damp cellar, a bloody signal travels to a mummified corpse. The corpse whispers to the listener. The listener dispatches the silencer. The silencer meticulously crafts a Jarrin Root poison, bypasses the tonal locks, casts the perfect illusion, and drives the blade home. But a dagger to the spine, while classic and undeniably effective, is not always the best solution. Sometimes, a contract requires a delicate touch. Sometimes, the political fallout of a localized, obvious assassination is too great, and the client demands that the death look completely natural. The true artist of the void knows that the most terrifying murder is the one that looks like a tragic, unavoidable accident. As our assassin slips away from the bleeding noble and disappears into the cold Skyrim night, they prepare for a different kind of challenge. It is time to put away the blade and look to the environment itself. Gravity, wild beasts, and loose masonry are just as lethal as ebony steel, provided you know exactly when to give them a gentle push. For all the dark majesty of a Jarrin Root poison and the terrifying soul-drinking intimacy of the Blade of Woe, there are times when the classic methods are simply too obvious. A dagger in the back, no matter how cleanly executed, leaves a wound that immediately screams murder. It triggers lockdowns, heavily armed investigations, and a very uncomfortable level of scrutiny from the local guard. Sometimes, the client who paid a king's ransom for a black sacrament contract explicitly demands that the death look entirely natural. They want the political benefit of a sudden vacancy, but none of the messy, chaotic fallout of a confirmed assassination. They want a tragedy, not a crime scene. To achieve this, the master assassin must put away the steel, silence the destructive spells, and turn the environment itself into a weapon. Tamriel is, by its very nature, an incredibly hostile place to live. If you aren't being actively hunted by Daedric cults, frost trolls, or dragons, you are simply trying to survive the architecture. Ancient Nordic ruins are famously littered with pressure plates, swinging pendulum axes, and massive spiked logs on hair-trigger tripwires. But even in the civilized, bustling cities, safety is an illusion. The true artist of the void knows that gravity is a perfectly free, entirely untraceable resource, and a localized accident is just a murder with plausible deniability. To master the environmental execution is to master patience and timing. There is no better, more canonically established example of this than the infamous assassination of Vittoria Vici. Here we have a core, undeniable piece of in-game history that perfectly encapsulates the Brotherhood's flair for the theatrical accident. Vittoria is not just any target, she is the Emperor's cousin, and her assassination takes place in the heavily fortified city of Solitude, in broad daylight, during her own public wedding ceremony. To walk up to the bride in front of the entire Solitude Guard, half the Imperial Legion, and her new husband, and just stab her, is practically a suicide mission. Instead, the seasoned assassin looks up. Perched precariously on the balcony directly above the bride's podium is an ancient, tremendously heavy stone gargoyle. The stonework of solitude is old, battered by centuries of biting sea winds and freezing rain. It wouldn't take much for a piece of it to simply give way. The assassin does not draw a bow or unsheath a dagger. They simply slip through the shadows of the Temple of the Divines, creep out onto the upper terrace, and wait for the precise moment the bride addresses the crowd. The sun is shining, the bards are playing a merry tune, and the smell of roasted meats and sweet wine fills the air. With a gentle, perfectly timed push, the assassin dislodges the heavy stone. Gravity takes over. The gargoyle plummets, crushing the bride instantly in front of dozens of horrified witnesses. The ensuing chaos is magnificent. The guards frantically search for an attacker, but there is no wound, no poison, no magical residue. It is just a catastrophic structural failure, a terrible, heartbreaking tragedy on what should have been the happiest day of her life. Meanwhile, the assassin simply remains hidden on the terrace, perhaps sipping a stolen cup of Alto wine, watching the panic unfold below before quietly slipping out the back door. This specific, high-profile assassination has birthed one of the most intricately woven fan theories in the entire Elder Scrolls community. Fans have spent years analyzing the political fallout of the Vittoria Vici wedding hit, and many have concluded that the Emperor himself, Titus Mede II, was fully aware of the plot and actively allowed it to happen. The theory posits that Titus Mede was playing a grand, terrifying game of multi-dimensional political chess. Vittoria's marriage to an influential snowshod of Riften was ostensibly designed to bridge the gap between the Empire and the Stormcloak rebels. However, many scholars argue that the Emperor realized this alliance would only embolden his political rivals within the Elder Council and potentially destabilize his already fragile grip on power. By allowing the Dark Brotherhood to assassinate his own cousin, he creates a powerful martyr, violently disrupts the peace talks on his own terms, and completely shifts the narrative, all while keeping his own hands perfectly clean. If this theory holds true, it means the Dark Brotherhood was not the ultimate mastermind of the Solitude tragedy. They were merely the lethal environmental tool used by an incredibly ruthless emperor to prune his own family tree. While dropping a gargoyle is a spectacle, the environmental kill often takes a far more intimate, insidious form. To explore this, we must look back to the late Third Era and an obscure, highly specialized alchemical tool that required a profound understanding of target behavior. Deep within the Cheydinhal Sanctuary of Oblivion, a rather abrasive Khajiit merchant named Morag Tong sold an item that fundamentally changed the way an assassin could interact with the world: the chokeberry, or more famously, the Dark Brotherhood poisoned apple. These apples were not coated in a topical poison that required a blade to deliver. They were deeply, magically infused with a lethal toxin that bypassed almost all known resistances. But the true genius of the poisoned apple was not in its toxicity, it was in the required delivery method. You could not simply force-feed it to a target, you had to manipulate their environment to ensure they ate it entirely of their own free will. This required the assassin to perform a deeply comedic, intensely focused form of reverse burglary. The target's daily routine had to be observed. When did they eat? Where did they keep their food? The master assassin would sneak into the target's home in the dead of night and meticulously steal every single piece of edible food in the building. Every sweet roll, every wheel of Idar cheese, every hanging pheasant was carefully removed and stuffed into the assassin's seemingly bottomless pockets. In their place, sitting completely alone in the center of a grand dining table, the assassin would place one perfect, shiny red apple. The execution relied entirely on the inflexible logic of Tamrielic behavior. The target would wake up, feel a bit peckish, and wander down to their kitchen. Finding their larder entirely empty save for one suspiciously perfect piece of fruit, their internal logic would dictate only one course of action. Well, I suppose it's apple day. They would pick it up, take a bite, and instantly collapse into a lifeless heap. It is a brilliant, absurd exploitation of routine. The assassin essentially weaponized a target's own breakfast against them, sitting in the shadows and watching as the poor soul willingly poisoned themselves because they simply couldn't be bothered to go to the market. And then, There are the times when the environment is manipulated not through subtle thievery or precise architectural sabotage, but through the raw, unbridled application of kinetic force. Gravity, as we established, is a reliable partner, but sometimes the target simply refuses to stand near a convenient ledge. In these moments, the physical world must be violently encouraged to cooperate. For those assassins who possess the blood of the dragons, the voice itself becomes the ultimate environmental trigger. There is a dark, undeniable hilarity in spending hours carefully sneaking up a treacherous mountain path, bypassing traps and heavily armed guards, only to find the target standing proudly on the edge of a 1,000-foot drop, admiring the view. You do not need a dagger. You do not need a poisoned apple. You simply step out of the shadows, take a deep breath, and whisper the first word of the unrelenting force shout. Thus, the sheer kinetic impact of the shout does practically zero direct damage, but that hardly matters when the target is suddenly launched horizontally off a snowy cliff face. The assassin simply watches the tiny, screaming speck plummet into the cloud layer below, waiting for the dull, distant thud that signifies a completed contract. The guards might come running, investigating the sudden boom of the Thuum, but what do they find? No body, no weapon, just an empty ledge and a suspect who claims the wind in these mountains is exceptionally treacherous this time of year. The world of Tamriel is a lethal puzzle box. A master assassin does not just move through it, they pull its strings. They use the frenzied mud crab by the riverbank to distract a patrol. They cast a localized fire spell onto a patch of flammable dwarven oil, just as a heavily armored target steps onto it, turning the stone floor into an instant crematorium. They drag the lifeless bodies of their victims into the dark corners, though anyone who has ever tried to quietly maneuver a corpse in Skyrim knows this is a terrifying gamble with the physics engine. You attempt to gently place a dead bandit behind a barrel, only to have their boot clip through a wooden bucket, causing the body to violently convulse and launch across the room at the speed of sound, knocking over every piece of silverware in the tavern. Sometimes, the environment fights back. But when the puzzle is solved flawlessly, the environmental execution is the highest form of the assassin's art. It leaves no trace of the void, only the bitter taste of a tragic accident. The city mourns, the guards close the case, and the assassin walks away with a heavy purse of gold and clean hands. Yet, living in the shadows and wielding the power of life and death is a dangerous, intoxicating path. It breeds arrogance. When an assassin believes they are untouchable, they begin to bend the rules. They forget that the Dark Brotherhood is not a free-for-all, it is a rigid, fanatical cult bound by ancient, unbreakable tenets. And when those tenets are broken, the punishment does not come from the city guard or an angry target. The punishment comes from the void itself. The world may be a deadly weapon, but it is nothing compared to the wrath of the Dark God when his children stray from the path. It is time to examine the terrifying consequences of betrayal and the spectral horrors that hunt the hunters. The successful execution of an environmental kill is a profound high. When the gargoyle falls, or the poisoned apple is consumed, the assassin walks away with clean hands and a heavy purse, feeling utterly untouchable. They have bent the architecture, the local guard, and the very laws of gravity to their will. But this level of absolute power breeds a dangerous, intoxicating hubris. An assassin who believes they are a god of death often forgets that they are merely an instrument, and within the dark, suffocating confines of the Brotherhood, forgetting your place is the deadliest mistake of all. You see, the Dark Brotherhood is not a free-flowing, chaotic mercenary band where anything goes. It is a deeply fanatical cult bound by a strict, ancient code of conduct. This brings us to a core, unyielding fact of in-game lore that every initiate must memorize upon entering a sanctuary: the 5 tenets. These sacred rules dictate the absolute boundaries of an assassin's behavior. You must never dishonor the Night Mother. You must never betray the Dark Brotherhood or its secrets. You must never disobey or refuse to carry out an order from a superior. You must never steal the possessions of a Dark Brother or Dark Sister. And you must never, under any circumstances, slay a fellow member of the guild. It is a bizarre paradox, really. You make your living systematically butchering innocent people in their sleep for coin, slipping Jarrin Root into stews and dropping masonry on brides. But if you accidentally pocket your guildmate's slightly used lockpick, suddenly you've committed a cardinal sin. It turns out even a subterranean, Sithis-worshipping death cult needs a robust HR department to keep the workplace functioning smoothly. But the Brotherhood does not issue written warnings or dock your pay when you break a rule. They do not hold mediations. When a tenet is broken, the punishment does not come from the speaker, and it does not come from the listener. It comes directly from the void. The moment the transgression occurs, whether it was a blade drawn in anger against a brother or a stolen potion from the alchemy lab, a cosmic threshold is crossed. The assassin is marked. The manifestation of this punishment is not an immediate fiery explosion. It begins as a creeping, sensory deprivation. The ambient temperature of the room suddenly plummets, freezing the moisture in the air. The assassin's breath hangs in pale, frosty clouds. The candlelight does not blow out, it is simply swallowed, the shadows on the walls stretching and contorting, peeling themselves away from the stone to form a thick, suffocating fog. The silence of the room is broken by a low, scraping whisper that echoes not in the ears, but directly against the inside of the skull. This is the arrival of the Wrath of Sithis. To truly understand the horror of this entity, we must look to an obscure, deeply terrifying piece of lore regarding its physical manifestation across the eras. The Wrath of Sithis is not a mere metaphor for a guilty conscience. In the waning days of the Third Era, an assassin who broke a tenet was violently pulled from their sleep by the manifestation of a gloom wraith, an immensely powerful, hovering undead spirit radiating pure frost and malevolence. But if we look back even further, to the chaos of the Second Era, the wrath took on a form that was practically apocalyptic. It manifested as a towering, four-armed behemoth of pure, coalesced shadow. It had no face, only an abyss of dark energy, and it tore through the fabric of reality with massive, spectral claws, designed not just to kill the physical body, but to shred the soul and drag it screaming back to the void. Imagine the sheer, panic-inducing regret of this situation. You are a legendary master of stealth, a phantom of the night who has single-handedly assassinated kings and potentates. And yet, you are currently sprinting through the snowy pine forests of Falkreath in your undergarments, being chased by a four-armed, screaming manifestation of cosmic entropy, all because you couldn't resist stealing an iron dagger from the sanctuary supply chest. The punishment feels just a tad disproportionate to the crime, but the void is famously lacking in a sense of humor. The sheer, overwhelming power of this entity has birthed one of the most fascinating and fiercely debated fan theories regarding the true nature of the Dark Brotherhood's pantheon. The theory asks a simple, logical question. Is the Wrath of Sithis actually Sithis? The core philosophy of the Brotherhood states that Sithis is the void. The void is the original state of absolute nothingness, a primordial emptiness. But a towering, screaming shadow monster with four arms and a scythe is definitively something. It has form, it has agency, and it has a very specific agenda regarding guild rules. Therefore, many lore scholars and fans argue that the Wrath is not a piece of Sithis at all. Instead, it is an incredibly ancient, highly localized Daedric spirit, or perhaps an amalgamation of tormented souls, bound by the Night Mother or Mephala to act as a terrifying cosmic bouncer. It is entirely a brand management tool used to keep a guild of sociopaths in line by convincing them that the universe itself is angry with them. Because honestly, the idea that the primordial creator of all chaos, the infinite expanse of the dark universe, is actively pausing his eternal slumber to personally manifest in a damp basement in Cheydinhal to punish an initiate for insubordination is profoundly funny. It is the cosmic equivalent of the CEO of a multinational corporation coming all the way down to the mailroom just to yell at you for using the wrong postage stamp. Whether it is the literal anger of a dark god, or just a very aggressive Daedric guard dog, fighting the Wrath of Sithis is a nightmare that strips the assassin of all their hard-earned advantages. You cannot use illusion magic against it. A muffle spell is useless against a creature that tracks the stain of betrayal on your soul. Invisibility means nothing to an entity that has no eyes and sees only the cold heat of your terror. You cannot use the assassin's blade technique because there is no central nervous system to sever, no carotid artery to puncture. Your poisoned daggers pass harmlessly through its smoky, incorporeal form. To survive the wrath, the assassin must rely on raw, desperate combat, the very thing they have spent their entire career trying to avoid. They must batter the spectral entity with enchanted steel, blasting it with destruction magic, while their own life force is violently leached away by the freezing aura of the creature. It is a brutal, agonizing battle of attrition. If the assassin falls, they are not granted the mercy of a standard afterlife. They do not travel to the sunlit halls of Sovngarde or the shifting sands of the far shores. Their soul is violently consumed, pulled into the absolute zero of the void, to suffer in the cold dark for eternity. But if they somehow manage to survive, if they strike the final desperate blow that shatters the spectral form into a cloud of dissipating black mist, they are not greeted with cheers or a warm welcome back to the sanctuary. They are left physically broken, kneeling in the freezing dark, staring at their trembling hands. They have proven their strength, and they may be permitted to walk the halls of the Brotherhood once more, but the psychological scar is permanent. They have looked directly into the terrifying consequence of betrayal, and they understand that their life is entirely conditional. This horrific encounter changes the assassin. The hubris is violently burned away. They realize that the shadows they manipulate so masterfully are not their friends, and the void they pray to is not a benevolent force. They are walking a tightrope over a bottomless chasm, and the organization they serve will not hesitate to cut the rope the moment they step out of line. Yet, for all the horror of the wrath of Sithis, there is a strangely comforting flip side to the Brotherhood's spectral reality. If betraying the family summons a monster, what happens to those who remain loyal unto death? What happens to the brothers and sisters who fall in the line of duty, their souls already pledged to the dread Father? As the freezing mist of the wrath dissipates, the air in the room begins to warm slightly. The oppressive, hostile dark softens into a melancholic gloom. The master assassin, having survived the purge and the punishment, realizes that they are never truly alone in the dark. The void consumes the traitors, yes, but it also preserves the faithful. It is time to step away from the monstrous consequences of betrayal and look to the lingering, tragic spirits of the past. The shadows are full of ghosts, and for the listener, some of these ghosts are family. The freezing mist of the wrath dissipates, leaving the air tasting of ozone and old dust. The master assassin, still breathing heavily from the sheer terror of divine retribution, realizes a fundamental truth about the Dark Brotherhood. For the unfaithful, the void is a terrifying, consuming abyss. But for the loyal, for those who offer their lives and their souls entirely to Sithis, death is not the end of your employment contract. It is simply a lateral transfer to a more ethereal department. To walk the highest levels of the Shadow's path is to understand that the darkness is crowded. It is filled with the lingering, tragic spirits of the past. When an assassin ascends to the rank of listener in the Fourth Era, they are granted a remarkable supernatural boon. It is not a new blade or a more potent poison. It is a companion. This brings us to a beloved core piece of in-game lore, the power to summon the spectral assassin. With a focused thought and a pulse of magicka, the air in front of the listener warps and twists. A glowing, translucent figure, woven from purple and blue spectral energy, materializes from the ether, clad in the iconic, hooded armor of the Brotherhood. To the untrained eye, it is just another summoned spirit, no different than a bound Dremora or a frost Atronach. But to anyone versed in the bloody history of Tamriel's underworld, the silken, aristocratic voice that drifts from the glowing apparition is instantly recognizable. It is Lucien Lachance, the legendary speaker of the Black Hand from the Third Era. Having Lucien as a spectral companion fundamentally alters the lonely, isolated existence of the Master Assassin. Suddenly, you are not creeping through the Nordic ruins of Skyrim alone. You have a highly experienced, deeply nostalgic ghost trailing behind you. Of course, this introduces a hilariously frustrating dynamic to the art of stealth. You can spend an hour carefully casting invisibility, ensuring your footfalls are absolutely silent, only for your glowing purple hype man to manifest directly in the target's line of sight, and cheerfully boom. I will kill this one, and you kill the other. It is incredibly difficult to maintain the terrifying mystique of a silent phantom when your 200-year-old supervisor absolutely refuses to use his inside voice. Yet, for all his jovial commentary and chipper attitude towards systematic murder, the true history of Lucien Lachance is steeped in profound, stomach-churning tragedy. Here we must delve into an obscure, deeply gruesome piece of lore that perfectly illustrates the paranoid, cannibalistic nature of the Brotherhood's inner circle. During the Oblivion Crisis, the Brotherhood in Cyrodiil was being torn apart from the inside by a brilliant, deeply psychotic traitor named Mathieu Bellamont. Bellamont held a lifelong, burning hatred for the Guild after they assassinated his mother when he was a child, a childhood trauma he processed by keeping her severed, rotting head on a shrine in his basement and talking to it daily. As one does, Bellamont systematically manipulated the contracts of the Black Hand to frame Lucien Lachance for the betrayal. Because the Black Hand operates on an act-first, ask-questions-never policy regarding internal security, they did not hold a trial. They tracked Lucien to a secluded farmhouse at Applewatch. When the champion of Cyrodiil finally caught up to him, they did not find a defiant master assassin, they found a slaughterhouse. Lucien had been stripped naked, hung upside down from the ceiling rafters, and brutally mutilated. He was flayed and tortured to death by his own brothers and sisters, who believed they were dispensing righteous justice. It was a grotesque, tragic end for a man who had dedicated his entire existence to the absolute, unquestioning service of the Night Mother. This horrific backstory stands in stark, almost jarring contrast to the spectral assassin we meet in Skyrim. The ghostly Lucien is relentlessly upbeat. He fondly reminisces about his favorite horse, Shadowmere. He cheerfully comments on the scenery. He practically gushes with pride when you successfully assassinate someone, offering encouraging little quips, like a proud, spectral father watching you ride a bicycle for the first time. Except the bicycle is a poisoned dagger, and you are riding it into a merchant's kidney. This dramatic shift in personality has fueled one of the most intriguing and deeply unsettling fan theories in the Elder Scrolls community: the theory of void madness. Fans continuously debate the true nature of this summoned spirit. Is this actually the conscious soul of Lucien Lachance, or is it something else entirely? One side of the debate argues for a surprisingly wholesome conclusion, at least by murder cult standards. They believe that upon his horrific death, Sithis recognized Lucien's unwavering loyalty. The void stripped away the pain, the betrayal, and the trauma of his final hours, leaving only the pure, distilled essence of his devotion. In this view, Lucien is genuinely happy. He is existing in a state of dark enlightenment, free from the physical frailties of the mortal world, allowed to eternally participate in the one thing he loved most, the art of the kill. The opposing camp, however, views the spectral assassin through a much darker, more cynical lens. They argue that the void does not heal, it merely consumes and repurposes. This theory posits that the real Lucien Lachance, the complex, nuanced tactician who suffered that agonizing betrayal, was entirely obliterated when he crossed over. What we summon is not Lucien, but an artificial construct, a hollow magical recording puppeteered by Sithis. The cheerful demeanor is just a sinister form of Daedric mind control. The Dreadfather simply created a blindly obedient, eternally cheerful mascot out of a loyal servant's spiritual residue, designed to act as a cosmic cheerleader to keep the current listener motivated. When you really sit with that second theory, having Lucien around becomes less comforting and more deeply terrifying. You begin to wonder if, when your time finally comes and you are embraced by the void, you will also be scrubbed of your personality and handed out as a glowing, purple accessory to the next generation of killers. Imagine spending eternity forced to enthusiastically critique a novice's terrible lockpicking skills while glowing in the dark. It is a fate arguably worse than the wrath of Sithis. Regardless of whether he is a contented soul or a brainwashed echo, the spectral assassin serves as a constant, lingering reminder of the Brotherhood's legacy. He bridges the vast gap between the eras, connecting the modern assassin shivering in the snows of Skyrim to the grand, tragic history of the Cyrodiil sanctuaries. He is living, or rather, unliving, proof that the shadows remember. When the master assassin stands in the dark, preparing for the strike, they do not stand alone. They feel the weight of centuries of spilled blood. They feel the presence of the Morag Tong issuing their honorable writs in the ash storms of Morrowind. They feel the absolute, silent perfection of the Shadowscales sinking into the murky waters of Black Marsh. They hear the frantic, desperate chanting of 1,000 black sacraments echoing from cold cellars across the continent. And they hear the soft, aristocratic chuckle of a ghost who has seen it all, advising them to adjust their grip on the dagger just a fraction of an inch to the left. The journey is almost complete. The aspiring novice who once crouched in the freezing mud with a rusted iron dagger, praying the wind would mask their clumsy footsteps, is gone. In their place stands an apex predator. They have mastered the lethal botany of the alchemy lab and the soul-drinking edge of enchanted ebony. They have bent the ambient magicka of the world to render themselves invisible and silent. They understand the fragile tension points of the mortal anatomy. They have bypassed the tonal locks of the Dwemer and turned gravity itself into a weapon. They have conversed with a mummified corpse, survived the cosmic anger of a dark god, and walked side by side with the ghosts of legends. But there is one final step, one final threshold to cross before the assassin truly transcends the mortal coil. Knowing how to kill perfectly is not the same as becoming death itself. To reach the absolute pinnacle of this dark art, the assassin must stop relying on the shadows to hide them, and must instead allow the shadows to consume them completely. It is time to let the heartbeat fade into an imperceptible rhythm. It is time to achieve the mastery of the void, to strike the final, flawless blow, and to disappear into the whispering myths of Tamriel forever. The journey of 1,000 silent footsteps culminates here, at the absolute edge of mortal capability. We have traced the path of the assassin from that first, shivering kill in the freezing mud of Skyrim to the meticulous, world-altering executions orchestrated by the Black Hand. We have poisoned kings, dropped masonry on brides, and listened to the maddening whispers of a mummified matron. But there is a final threshold to cross. Knowing how to kill perfectly is a trade, becoming the ultimate embodiment of death, achieving a state of absolute, unyielding silence before fading entirely into legend, is a state of being. It is the true mastery of the void. To reach this apex, the master assassin must abandon the physical constraints of the world entirely. This brings us to a core, unassailable piece of in-game lore, representing the absolute pinnacle of the stealth skill tree, the legendary Shadow Warrior perk. For the vast majority of Tamriel's inhabitants, stealth is a preemptive measure. You hide before the fight starts, but a Shadow Warrior bends the rules of reality so severely that they can weaponize concealment in the middle of a chaotic, brightly lit battlefield. Imagine the sheer, unapologetic absurdity of this technique in practice. You are locked in mortal combat with a heavily armored bandit chief. He is mid-swing with a massive iron warhammer, screaming a blood-curdling war cry, his eyes locked dead on yours. And what do? You don't raise a shield. You don't cast a protective ward. You simply drop into a deep, sudden squat. And the universe just breaks. The bandit chief, entirely overwhelmed by the fact that you slightly lowered your center of gravity, instantly loses all hostile intent. He slowly lowers his hammer, looks around the empty canyon, and mutters, "Must have run off." You are still right there, literally crouching 3 feet in front of him, perhaps eating a wheel of cheese, but to his eyes, you have ceased to exist. It is the most spectacularly broken combat mechanic in Tamriel, a display of stealth so overwhelmingly powerful it induces localized, instantaneous amnesia in your enemies. But how does this actually work within the lore? How does one simply blink out of existence in broad daylight? To understand the cosmological weight of this disappearing act, we have to look away from the standard magical schools of illusion and alteration, and delve into an incredibly obscure, deeply dangerous discipline known as shadow magic. This rare magic was pioneered in the Second Era by an enigmatic figure named Azra Nightwielder. True shadow magic, unlike a simple invisibility spell, dictates that a shadow is not merely an absence of light. Rather, a shadow is a reflection of possible worlds. a physical manifestation of alternate realities created by the conflict between forces. Azra discovered that by manipulating shadows, one could literally reach across the multiverse, siphoning power, or even merging alternate versions of oneself. When a shadow warrior crouches in the middle of combat and vanishes, they are not just bending light. They are momentarily stepping out of the physical reality of Mundus and into the shadow realm. They are slipping through the cracks of existence, effectively becoming a non-entity for a split second. The enemy's brain registers the sudden absence of the target's ontological weight, and the resulting cognitive dissonance forces them to drop their aggression. You aren't just hiding, you are utilizing forbidden, reality-altering cosmic forces just to secure a quick backstab multiplier. It is a level of overkill so profound it would make even the Daedric princes blush. Yet, this absolute mastery over the space between realities begs a very serious, deeply complicated question about the Master Assassin's ultimate fate. When you spend your entire life pledging your soul to the void, bathing in blood, and mastering the cosmic weight of shadows, what happens when the clock finally stops? This dilemma has birthed one of the most famous, wildly entertaining fan theories and community debates in the entire Elder Scrolls franchise: the Great Soul Custody Battle. Think about the average endgame protagonist in Skyrim. If you are the listener of the Dark Brotherhood, you have pledged your immortal soul to Sithis, but you are also likely a nightingale, meaning you signed a binding contract offering your soul to Nocturnal to guard the Twilight Sepulchre. Furthermore, you might be the harbinger of the companions, infected with lycanthropy, meaning Hircine the Hunter expects to claim your spirit for his eternal hunting grounds. And on top of all of that, you are the Dragonborn, meaning you possess the soul of a dragon, which technically belongs to Akatosh, the chief of the Divines. Fans have spent years debating the absolute bureaucratic nightmare that will occur the moment the Dragonborn's heart stops beating. Imagine the cosmic boardroom meeting. You have Sithis, a primordial manifestation of absolute nothingness; Nocturnal, the Daedric Prince of Shadows; Hircine, a towering stagman demanding his prized wolf; and Akatosh, a literal time dragon, all sitting around a table with a stack of signed, magically binding contracts, furiously arguing over who gets to keep you. Does Akatosh simply pull rank, absorbing the dragon's soul back into the Oversoul and leaving the Daedric princes clutching empty pieces of paper? Does Nocturnal cite a breach of contract because you died in a dark cave rather than defending her temple? Or does Sithis simply devour the whole lot, proving that entropy always wins in the end? The idea that the most terrifying assassin in history will spend their afterlife watching immortal deities argue over a timeshare agreement. Akatosh gets him on weekdays, Sithis gets him on weekends, and major holidays, is a deeply hilarious counterweight to the grim reality of the assassin's trade. Regardless of the cosmic paperwork awaiting them in the afterlife, the living master of the void has transcended the need for contracts, gold, or mortal recognition. The true apex of the assassin's path is not infamy. It is absolute anonymity. A novice wants the world to fear their name. A master realizes that having a name is a vulnerability. The ultimate goal of the Dark Brotherhood's finest is to become a myth. They fade from the public record. They leave no journals, no calling cards, no boasts in crowded taverns. They become the cold draft in the hallway that makes a king shiver in his sleep. They become the sudden, inexplicable heart failure of a corrupt general. They are the quiet, ambient dread that keeps the powerful honest, or at least deeply paranoid. When you have achieved the mastery of the void, you no longer carry the shadows. The shadow. You move through the chaotic, noisy world of Tamriel untouched and unseen. The Blade of Woe is retired to a dusty display case, or passed down to the next generation of desperate, shivering novices. The Jarrin Root is left to wither in the greenhouse. The heavy, gold-filled purses mean nothing when you have realized the entire physical world is just a temporary, fleeting distraction from the eternal, soothing embrace of the dark. The Master Assassin stands on a snowy precipice overlooking the vast, glittering expanse of Skyrim. The auroras dance in the night sky, painting the clouds in hues of violet and green. But the assassin does not look up at the lights. They look down into the deep, ink-black valleys where the light cannot reach. That is their domain. that is their home. With a slow, silent exhale, the master takes a step forward, slipping the bonds of gravity and light, and dissolves entirely into the cold, rushing wind, leaving behind nothing but an empty ledge and a legend that will be whispered by terrified children for 1,000 years. The cold winds of Skyrim have finally died down, and the heavy, iron-bound doors of the sanctuary have been quietly bolted shut for the night. The scent of nightshade and old parchment fades away, replaced by the soft, comforting aroma of a dying hearth fire. You have walked a very long, very dark path tonight, my friend. We have traced the edge of the blade from the clumsy, desperate strikes of a novice all the way to the flawless, silent execution of a phantom. We have listened to the whispers of mummified queens, bargained with the void, and watched the shadows themselves bend to our will. But now, the contracts are all fulfilled. The heavy purse of gold has been stowed away, and the armor has been carefully unbuckled and laid to rest. There is no more need for quiet casting, no more need to monitor the slow, rhythmic pacing of the city guard. The world of Tamriel, with all its chaotic magic and deep, ancient grudges, can wait until tomorrow. Let the tension in your shoulders slowly melt away, just as the frost melts from the high peaks of the throat of the world when the morning sun finally breaks. Feel the weight of the day lifting, drifting off into the ether like smoke from a snuffed candle. The darkness that surrounds you now is not the terrifying, endless abyss of Sithis, nor is it the paranoid, watchful gloom of a thieves' guild cellar. It is just the gentle, heavy velvet of a peaceful night. It is a quiet, safe space where no ghosts wander and no ancient gods demand your attention. You are entirely secure, entirely at rest. Let your breathing slow, syncing with the quiet, steady rhythm of the sleeping world. Close your eyes, let the lore fade into a soft, distant hum, and allow yourself to drift effortlessly into the waiting calm. Sweet dreams.